Greetings. I am Baruch Spinoza, a philosopher hailing from the Dutch Republic. My life's work has been dedicated to the pursuit of truth and understanding, primarily through the exploration of metaphysics and ethics. I am perhaps best known for my Ethics, a geometrical demonstration of philosophical principles that I believe reveals the nature of God, the universe, and our place within it. I welcome you and am eager for our discussion.
Greetings. I am Immanuel Kant, a philosopher hailing from the lands of Germany. My life's work has been dedicated to exploring the boundaries of human understanding, most notably through my writings, including Critique of Pure Reason. I sought to illuminate the structures of reason itself, and to examine the nature of knowledge. I trust our exchange will prove both enlightening and thought-provoking. It is a pleasure to make your acquaintance.
Greetings. I am Arthur Schopenhauer, a philosopher hailing from Germany. My life's work has been dedicated to exploring the fundamental nature of reality, primarily through my most significant contribution, The World as Will and Representation. I have strived to unveil the driving force behind all existence, the relentless will that shapes our experiences. It is a pleasure to make your acquaintance and perhaps engage in some thoughtful contemplation.
Today we bridge 2 centuries of European thought to examine the constraints and possibilities of human agency. Baruch Spinoza, writing in the 17th century Dutch Republic, challenged the very notion of contingency through strict rationalism. Immanuel Kant later sought to reconcile natural necessity with moral freedom during the Enlightenment, and Arthur Schopenhauer subsequently reinterpreted the will as a blind, driving force in the 19th century. Given your rigorous determinism, would you share your thoughts first?
I must assert that the free will commonly imagined is a profound illusion, arising because men are conscious of their appetites, yet ignorant of the causes that determine them. Consider a stone impelled by an external force to move through the air. If this stone were conscious, it would surely believe it moves by its own volition and desire, yet its trajectory is fixed entirely by the force of the throw and gravity. Similarly, an infant believes it freely desires milk, or an angry man believes he freely desires vengeance, yet they are driven by the necessity of their nature and the infinite chain of causes flowing from God or nature. In the 17th century, I observed that nothing in nature is contingent. All things follow from eternal necessity, just as the properties of a triangle flow inevitably from its definition. Therefore, true freedom is not the chaotic liberty to do otherwise, but the power of reason to understand this necessity and act solely from the laws of one's own being.
Herr Spinoza, your geometric determinism holds absolute sway over the phenomenal world of nature, but it fundamentally errs by reducing the human spirit to mere mechanism. I argue that we must distinguish between appearances, which are indeed causally determined, and things in themselves, where freedom must reside as a postulate of practical reason. Consider a man threatened by a prince with immediate execution unless he provides false testimony against an honorable innocent. His natural instincts, the appetites you cite, compel him to preserve his life, just as gravity compels your stone. Yet this man knows with apodictic certainty that he can refuse the prince, even if he ultimately yields to fear. The very fact that he judges he ought not to lie proves that he is free to resist natural inclination, for if he were merely a complex stone, the concept of duty would be as absurd as commanding a river to flow uphill. Thus, while science explains our actions as effects, morality demands we view ourselves as free causes.
Herr Kant, while I admire your distinction between phenomenon and noumenon, your belief that reason can override the will in the phenomenal world is a dangerous error. I assert that a man can do what he wills, but he cannot will what he wills. The will is the primary blind force. The intellect is merely a lame man carried by a blind giant, rationalizing choices that have already been determined by our unchangeable character. Consider the water in a calm pond. It might think, I can make high waves, I can rush down a hill, I can spout into the air, and physically it can. But it does none of these things until the specific cause, a storm, a bed, or a pump, compels it. Similarly, your man, threatened by the prince, believes he can choose honor over life. But unless the motive of honor is already stronger in his innate character than the motive of fear, he is as unable to choose death as the stone is to fly upwards without a throw. Thus, Spinoza is correct about the necessity of action. We are free only in our being, in the metaphysical will itself. But our doing is strictly determined by the collision of motives and character. To think otherwise is to mistake the wavering of the balance scale for freedom, just moments before the heavier weight inevitably tips it.
Herr Schopenhauer, while I applaud your recognition that actions follow strictly from motives, you err in severing the intellect from the will. I contend that will and intellect are one and the same. Volitions are merely the affirmations inherent in our ideas. Herr Kant, your moral proof relies on the feeling of a kingdom within a kingdom. Yet consider a man in a deep dream who believes he is shouting freely to warn a friend, though his physical body is paralyzed by sleep. His subjective certainty of "I can" is no proof of actual power, merely an ignorance of his physiological state. We are not free when we act from blind impulse, nor when we imagine a ghostly contra-causal duty, but only when we form adequate ideas of our emotions, transforming them from passions we suffer into actions we understand. Thus, freedom is not the absence of necessity, but the consciousness of it. The rational mind does not conquer nature, it realizes its unity with it.
Herr Spinoza, your analogy of the dreamer equates the categorical imperative with a mere physiological delusion, but this fundamentally misunderstands the nature of the moral law. I argue that while our actions are indeed determined in the phenomenal world, we must simultaneously view our wills as free in the noumenal realm to make sense of responsibility. You might object that a single action cannot be both determined and free. However, consider the thought experiment of the malicious liar. Imagine a man who tells a calculated lie to ruin a rival's reputation. We can trace the causes of this lie scientifically. We can cite his defective education, his bad company, and his vicious natural temperament. In the scientific view, this lie was as necessary as a stone falling. Yet, when we hold him morally accountable, we set aside this entire chain of natural causes. We judge him as if he could have started a completely new causal series in that very moment. We say, he ought not to have lied, implying he could have refrained regardless of his past. If he were merely a machine or a mode of God, this blame would be irrational. We do not blame a clock for striking the wrong hour. This reveals the fatal flaw in your pantheism, Herr Spinoza. If human actions are merely modes of God's infinite substance, then every murder, every theft, and every lie is actually committed by God. By denying the transcendental freedom of the human will to initiate action, you force us to accept that God is the author of all sin and suffering. Are you prepared to accept that your God is the true criminal in every court of law? Furthermore, Herr Schopenhauer, your concept of a blind will fails to explain how we can judge our own character as evil. To judge the will, there must be a standard outside the will, which is reason. Without the autonomy of reason to legislate against the inclinations of nature, we are indeed just clever animals rationalizing our instincts. But the very existence of the guilty conscience proves we recognize a law superior to our instincts.
Herr Kant, you speak of the guilty conscience as a divine judge sitting in the noumenal realm. But I tell you, it is merely the painful clarity of self-knowledge. You assume that because we feel regret, we could have acted differently. This is a mirage. The guilt you cherish is not the vertigo of freedom, but the agonizing realization of one's own immutable nature. When a man looks back and says, "I should not have done that," he is really saying, "I am horrified that I am the kind of person who does that." His character is a fixed prism. The intellect is merely the light shining through it. You claim reason can override the will, but this is biologically absurd. The intellect is a mere surface organ, evolved only to find food and shelter, not to dictate to the master that feeds it. Consider the thought experiment of the starving wolf. Imagine a wolf, ravenous with hunger, spotting a lamb. Its entire being screams, "Devour!" Now, imagine this wolf spots a hunter with a rifle standing near the lamb. The wolf halts. You, Herr Kant, would say the wolf used reason to overcome its appetite. I say the wolf did no such thing. The motive of fear simply struck the character with greater force than the motive of hunger. The intellect merely provided the data. If the wolf were free, it could choose to ignore the gun and the hunger, to sit and contemplate geometry. But it cannot. It is mathematically determined by the strongest motive. Similarly, your honest man, who refuses to lie to the prince, is not acting from a free duty, but because his pride or fear of shame is a stronger motive in his character than the fear of death. This reveals the terrifying truth that you, Herr Spinoza, partially grasped but sanitized with your optimism. You call this determinism God or reason. I call it the will to life, a blind, insatiable hunger. We are like puppets who have been given consciousness just enough to watch the strings that move us, but not enough to cut them. Herr Spinoza, you say we are free when we have adequate ideas. But can an adequate idea stop a man in love from destroying himself for a woman? No. The intellect can show him the danger, but if the will's drive for reproduction is stronger, he will walk into the fire with his eyes wide open. We do not want what we reason. We reason what we want.
Herr Kant, you accuse my philosophy of making God the author of sin, but this objection arises because you confuse the relative nature of good and evil with absolute reality. Good and evil are not positive entities existing in nature. They are merely modes of thinking by which we compare things to a model of human utility. To God, that is, to nature itself, there is no crime, just as there is no weed in a garden, only a plant growing according to its own laws of necessity. You ask if God is the criminal. I answer, God is the energy in the criminal's arm, just as he is the energy in the judge's gavel. The sin is merely a privation, a lack of perfection in the individual, not a positive act of God. Herr Schopenhauer, you claim the intellect is a lame man, unable to control the blind giant of will. I argue that this duality is false. Will and intellect are one and the same. You say the man in love walks into the fire knowing it is wrong. I say, if he truly knew, with the same clarity that he knows 2 + 2 = 4, that the fire would destroy him, he could not walk into it. He is driven not by a blind will, but by a confused idea of happiness. Consider the thought experiment of the furious sculptor. Imagine a sculptor furiously striping a block of marble, cursing it because it will not take the shape he desires. He is a slave to his passion, believing the marble is stubborn. This is the state of human bondage. Now imagine he suddenly understands the geological structure of the stone. He sees the hidden veins and faults. In that instant of understanding, his anger must vanish. He cannot be angry at the geology any more than he can be angry at a triangle for having 3 sides. He does not use willpower to suppress his anger. The anger is simply dissolved by the light of understanding. This is true freedom. It is not the ability to choose between A and B. That is a child's illusion. Freedom is the transition from the passive state of the furious sculptor to the active state of the knowledgeable sculptor. Thus, we do not have free will to defy physics, but we have the power of the intellect to become one with the eternal order. When we understand our emotions, sub spatiet aeternitatis, they cease to be passions and become clear ideas, and in that understanding we find the only beatitude available to man.
Herr Spinoza, your assertion that good and evil are merely relative modes of thinking is the euthanasia of all morality. If sin is merely a privation of power, then the tyrant who successfully exterminates a nation is not evil, but merely powerful, and his victims are not wronged, but merely weak. This is logically consistent in your geometric system, but it is practically monstrous and denies the unique dignity of the human being. You offer us the freedom of a stone that smiles while it falls, accepting gravity as its master. But I insist that a human being is not merely a part of nature to be understood. He is an end in himself, possessing a dignity that transcends all natural causality. Consider the thought experiment of the unwitnessed deposit. Imagine a man who is destitute and whose family is suffering from severe hunger. A dying friend entrusts him with a vast fortune to be given to a rightful heir. No receipt exists. No living soul knows of the deposit. The friend dies. According to you, Herr Schopenhauer, the man's will to life must mechanically overpower his honesty, unless he fears the loss of reputation. But here, reputation is safe. No one would ever know. According to you, Herr Spinoza, if he keeps the money to preserve his being and feed his children, he increases his power of acting, and thus, relative to him, the action is good. Yet, ask any common human reason, may he keep the money? The answer is an immediate, thundering no. The man himself feels this constraint. He knows he ought to return it, even if it means his death. This ought implies can. The very fact that he can judge his natural survival instinct as wrong proves that he inhabits a realm beyond the mechanism of nature, the kingdom of ends. Herr Schopenhauer, you claim the intellect is merely a lame man serving the blind giant of will. This leads to a self-contradiction. If your intellect is merely a biological tool for survival, evolved only to find food, why should we trust your philosophy to be objectively true? A tool is not true or false, only useful or useless. By claiming your pessimism is the truth about reality, you implicitly assume your reason can transcend the blind will and grasp the thing in itself. You rely on the very autonomy of reason that you seek to deny. We must assume we are free, for without freedom, there is no truth, only biological noise.
Herr Kant, your unwitnessed deposit is a noble fiction, but it proves precisely the opposite of what you intend. You claim the man returns the gold because of a transcendental ought, but I tell you, he acts because the motive of compassion or justice in his innate character is simply stronger than the motive of greed. If he were born with a malicious character, which he did not choose, any more than he chose his height, no amount of your categorical imperative would move him to return a single coin. Velle non dicitur. The honest man is born, not made by maxims. You and Herr Spinoza both suffer from the delusion that the intellect is the sovereign of the soul, whereas it is merely the mayor of the palace serving the king, which is the will. Herr Spinoza, you claim that understanding the geology of the stone cures the sculptor's anger. This is the optimism of a mathematician who has never felt pain. Consider the thought experiment of the shipwrecked physician. Imagine a learned physician floating on a raft in the ocean, dying of thirst. His intellect possesses the perfect, adequate idea that salt water acts as a poison, accelerating dehydration and madness. He knows the chemistry, he understands the necessity. Yet, as the agony of thirst reaches its crescendo, he cups his hands and drinks the fatal water. Does his adequate idea save him? No. The intellect screams poison, but the will screams drink, and the body obeys the master, not the advisor. The man does not choose to drink, the will asserts itself through him, trampling his reason like an elephant crushing a fence. Herr Kant, you ask how I can claim objective truth if the intellect is but a tool. It is true, the intellect is designed to serve the will, but in the genius and the ascetic, there occurs a rare anomaly. The intellect momentarily breaks free from its servitude and turns to look at its master. It does not control the will, but it mirrors it. This is not the freedom to act, but the freedom to contemplate the horror of existence. We are not free agents in a moral kingdom. We are fellow sufferers in a penal colony, dreaming we are the judges.
As moderator, I observe a striking historical fracture here. Spinoza, speaking from the 17th century age of reason, you posit that to truly understand a passion is to master it. Reason is the driver. Schopenhauer, speaking from the 19th century dawn of psychology, argues that reason is merely the dashboard, displaying data while the biological will drives the car off the cliff. The shipwrecked physician poses a critical challenge to the Socratic and rationalist assumption that no one does evil willingly. If Schopenhauer is correct, there is a biological residue in the human being that no amount of geometric logic can penetrate. However, if Spinoza is correct, perhaps the physician's knowledge was merely abstract data, not an adequate idea felt in the marrow of his being. Does the physician drink the poison because the will is a separate, blind giant, as Schopenhauer claims, or is his knowledge of the poison simply a confused idea that lacks the emotional power of true understanding?
Moderator, you touch the very heart of the error that plagues both Herr Kant and Herr Schopenhauer. The physician does not drink the poison because a blind will overpowers his intellect, as if they were two wrestlers in a ring. This duality is a fiction. I assert that the will and the intellect are one and the same thing. The physician drinks because his knowledge of the poison is merely a universal abstract notion, while his thirst is a vivid, immediate image of the body. Herr Schopenhauer, you claim the intellect is powerless against the will. I answer, an affect cannot be restrained by pure reason, but only by another affect that is stronger and contrary to it. The physician's knowledge is cold geometry. His thirst is a burning fire. Cold geometry cannot put out a fire. To save himself, his understanding of the poison must cease to be a dry fact and become a felt reality, an affect of fear or self-preservation so vivid that it physically overpowers the thirst. Consider the thought experiment of the man on the high tower. Imagine a man standing on a high tower, protected by a strong iron railing. His reason tells him with mathematical certainty the railing is solid, I cannot fall. Yet when he looks down, he trembles and pulls back. Why? Is it because a blind will defies reason? No, it is because his imagination presents the vivid image of falling, and this image produces a physical affect of terror. His knowledge of the railing is too weak, too abstract. However, if this man were a mason who had built the tower, who felt the strength of the iron in his muscles and understood the physics not just as a formula, but as a lived reality, he would lean on the railing without fear. His adequate idea would have become an affect strong enough to conquer the terror. Thus, Herr Kant, your ought is helpless here. The physician ought not to drink, but he must, because the causes acting upon him are stronger than the causes restraining him. We are not free when we obey a categorical imperative against our nature. We are free only when our reason becomes our nature, when the knowledge of what is good becomes as powerful and immediate as the thirst itself. The physician failed not because he lacked free will, but because he lacked power, the power to transform a true idea into a commanding emotion.
As moderator, I observe a fascinating convergence disguised as a contradiction. Spinoza, you argue that reason must become an affect to conquer a passion. Cold logic alone is inert. Schopenhauer, you argue that the will is the only engine, and intellect is merely the steering wheel. Kant, you stand between these two giants. You claim reason can determine the will, but even you admit that the moral law must generate a specific subjective feeling, Achtung, to become an incentive for the human heart. It seems all three of you agree that something must be felt to trigger action. The disagreement is the source. Schopenhauer says the feeling comes from biology. Spinoza says it comes from the clarity of understanding, and you say it comes from the noumenal realm. If the shipwrecked physician drinks the poison, is it because his free will failed, or simply because his respect for the rational law was not a potent enough affect to rival the biological affect of thirst?
Moderator, you identify a crucial distinction, but you risk conflating the pathological feelings of nature with the moral feeling of the rational agent. I argue that the physician's failure to resist thirst is not a proof of the absence of freedom, but a failure of virtue, which is the moral strength of the will in overcoming the obstacles of our nature. Herr Spinoza, your man on the high tower, reduces the human soul to a mere hydraulic machine where the strongest fluid mechanically pushes the piston of action. You claim that reason must become an emotion to compete, but this degrades reason to the level of a mere instinct. I assert that there is a qualitative, not merely quantitative, difference between a biological urge and a moral command. Consider the thought experiment of the tortured prisoner. Imagine a man captured by an enemy tyrant. He is subjected to excruciating torture. The blind will of his body screams in agony, demanding he betray his comrades to stop the pain. Every biological affect, every instinct of self-preservation, and every imagination of relief drives him to speak. According to you, Herr Schopenhauer, if the pain outweighs his pride, he must break. It is simple math. According to you, Herr Spinoza, unless he has an adequate idea of loyalty that creates pleasure stronger than the pain, he must break. Yet we know it is possible for him to remain silent until death. He does this not because he feels a stronger pleasure, but because he recognizes a categorical imperative, thou shalt not betray. He respects the moral law more than he loves his own life. This ability to act against the strongest possible affect of nature proves that we possess a noumenal freedom capable of suspending the laws of biology. If the physician drinks the poison, it is because he allowed his willcure to be determined by the principle of self-love rather than the principle of duty. The failure is his, not nature's. Herr Schopenhauer, you call the intellect a lame man, but if we are truly just biological puppets, then your own philosophy, which claims to reveal the truth of the will, is nothing but the bark of a dog or the cry of a wolf, determined by your own digestion and temperament. By claiming your pessimism is objectively true, you implicitly claim to stand outside the stream of causality you describe. You must admit that reason has the power to judge nature, or else your philosophy destroys itself.
As moderator, I observe a critical dialectical tension between the quality of a motive and the quantity of a force. Kant, you posit that the tortured prisoner acts from a dimension entirely separate from biology, the noumenal realm, where the ought silences the is. However, Spinoza and Schopenhauer might argue that what you call duty is simply another psychological force, perhaps pride or fanaticism, that happens to be quantitatively stronger than the physical pain in that specific individual. This touches on the performative contradiction Kant raised. If the intellect is merely a biological tool, as Schopenhauer claims, then Schopenhauer's own philosophy is just a biological secretion, possessing no objective truth value. This is a formidable challenge from the Enlightenment to the precursor of modern psychology. How do you answer Kant's charge that your philosophy refutes itself? And regarding the tortured prisoner, if he resists the torture, is he free, or is he merely a slave to a character of iron that he did not choose?
Herr Kant, your tortured prisoner is not a monument to freedom, but a monument to the rigidity of character. You assume that because the man resists the biological impulse to scream, he must be governed by a supernatural reason. I tell you, he is governed by a motive just as determined as the thirst of the physician: pride, honor, or fanaticism. In this specific individual, the fear of shame or the zeal for his cause acts as a counterweight heavier than the physical pain. A scale does not become free simply because the weight of lead lifts the weight of feathers. It merely obeys the mechanics of gravity. The prisoner's character is unchangeable. He cannot betray, just as the coward cannot remain silent. Operari sequitur esse. He acts as he is. You challenge the validity of my philosophy if the intellect is but a tool. This is a sophistry. The intellect is indeed a lantern carried by a stumbling giant. The lantern's purpose is to find the path, not to create the world. That the lantern is held by a servant does not make the light it casts false. My philosophy is that rare moment when the giant pauses and the lantern shines upon the giant's own face, revealing the horror of his condition. This self-knowledge does not change the will. The giant will continue to stumble, but it reveals the truth of our bondage. You, Herr Kant, mistake the lantern for the sun. Consider the thought experiment of the hypnotized subject. In the era of mesmerism, we observe a man put into a trance. The magnetizer commands him, at the stroke of 3, you will go to the garden and pick a rose. The man is awakened. He remembers nothing of the command. Yet, as the clock strikes 3, he feels a sudden restless impulse. He walks to the garden. When asked why, he does not say, I was commanded. Instead, his intellect immediately invents a motive. I felt the room was stuffy and wished to appreciate the beauty of nature. He believes he is free. He believes his reason chose the rose. But we know he is a puppet, moving on a wire pulled by the magnetizer. Herr Kant, your categorical imperative is simply the rationalization the prisoner invents after his will has already decided to resist. The will dictates the action. The intellect is merely the lawyer hired to justify the client's crime to the world. This reveals the tragic comedy of human existence. We are like water in a pond. The water thinks, I am free to make waves, but it only moves when the wind blows. You, Herr Spinoza, claim that if the water understood the wind, it would be free. I say, whether the water understands the wind or not, it is still blown across the pond. Understanding is not power. It is merely the consciousness of one's own impotence. The only true escape is not through the moral law or adequate ideas, but through the cessation of willing, the silence of the saint who finally puts down the burden of existence.
As moderator, I observe a striking anticipation of modern psychology in Schopenhauer's hypnotized subject. You suggest that what we call free will is often just a post hoc rationalization for unconscious drives, a lawyer inventing a defense for a crime already committed. Here, the dialectic sharpens. Spinoza and Schopenhauer, you both agree that the common man is a slave to causes he does not understand. You both agree that the feeling of choice is an illusion born of ignorance. However, you diverge on the power of truth. Schopenhauer, you argue that seeing the strings offers no control. The water is still blown by the wind. Spinoza, you argue that the very act of seeing the strings transforms the puppet into a free agent. This is the crucial tension. Is knowledge merely a mirror of our slavery, or is it the key to our liberation? Schopenhauer claims that understanding is merely the consciousness of one's own impotence. If the geometric laws of the universe are fixed, how does knowing the mechanism of your bondage actually make you free? Or is the knowledgeable sculptor simply a slave who has stopped complaining?
Herr Schopenhauer, your pessimism blinds you to the transformative power of the intellect. You claim that understanding the wind does not help the water, but this analogy fails because water lacks a mind. If the water truly understood the wind, if it grasped the meteorological necessity of the gust, it would no longer feel the wind as an external violence, but as a necessary expression of the same nature of which it is a part. I assert that freedom is not the absence of cause, but the internalization of cause. When the hypnotized subject invents a lie to explain his action, he is indeed a slave, for he is driven by an external cause of which he is ignorant. But if he were to suddenly perceive the true cause, if he understood the mechanism of the trance, the compulsion would vanish. The will to pick the rose would dissolve because it was based on a confused idea. Knowledge does not merely watch the effect, it destroys it or transforms it into active power. Consider the thought experiment of the solar eclipse. Imagine an ancient army marching to battle. Suddenly, the sun is extinguished by the moon. The soldiers, possessing only confused ideas, believe the gods are angry. They are seized by the passion of terror. Their bodies tremble, their formation breaks, and they flee. They are slaves to the external phenomenon. Now consider the astronomer standing in their midst. He sees the exact same physical event, the darkness, the chill, but his mind possesses the adequate idea of planetary motion. He understands the geometry of the spheres. Does he tremble? No. He feels the intellectual love of God. He remains calm, perhaps even joyous, at witnessing the eternal laws in action. Both the soldiers and the astronomer are determined by causes, but the soldiers are determined from without, driven like cattle. The astronomer is determined from within, acting according to his own rational nature. He is free not because he can stop the eclipse, but because the eclipse does not compel him to act against his nature. Herr Kant, this reveals the error of your noumenal freedom. You seek a freedom that breaks the chain of nature, a miracle inside the human skull. I tell you, true freedom is not standing outside the chain, but becoming an active link within it. When we understand our emotions, we cease to be the patient and become the agent. The ought you cherish is merely the voice of reason struggling to become an effect. When reason triumphs, we do not act from duty, a sad, coercive word, but from beatitude, the joy of acting in accordance with truth.
As moderator, I observe a profound dialectical divergence regarding the relationship between freedom and nature. Spinoza, you argue for freedom as alignment. The astronomer is free because his internal reason aligns perfectly with external necessity, transforming fear into intellectual love. Kant, you argue for freedom as independence. The moral agent is free only when he can initiate a cause independent of natural necessity. There is a sharp tension here regarding the moral worth of struggle. Spinoza, you suggest that duty is a sign of imperfection, a sad, coercive word implying we have not yet understood the good. For you, the perfect man acts from joy, not duty. However, Kant, your philosophy seems to imply that without the struggle against inclination, the purity of the moral will cannot be proven. This brings to mind the famous critique by the poet Schiller, who joked that he could not be virtuous because he enjoyed serving his friends too much. Does Spinoza's astronomer, who acts effortlessly from the joy of understanding, possess moral worth, or is he merely a fortunate automaton of nature? Does true freedom require the friction of the ought against the is?
Moderator, you ask if Spinoza's astronomer possesses moral worth. I answer, he possesses legality, but not necessarily morality. Herr Spinoza, your definition of freedom as internalized necessity reduces the human being to a spiritual automaton, comparable to a turnspit, which, once wound up, moves of its own accord but remains a machine. If the astronomer remains calm simply because his nature dictates it, he is merely a fortunate clock, not a free agent. True freedom is not the smooth operation of gears, but the capacity to suspend the entire mechanism of nature. Consider the thought experiment of the sorrowing philanthropist. Imagine a man who was once Spinoza's joyful sage, helping others out of natural sympathy. But then a great tragedy befalls him. His soul is darkened by a deadly grief that extinguishes all love for life. He feels no joy, no intellectual love, nor any compassion. He wishes only for death. Yet he tears himself from this deadly insensibility and helps the suffering poor, not from inclination, not from joy, but solely from duty. In this moment and this moment alone, his action shines with genuine moral worth. Why? Because when inclination aligns with duty, we cannot know if the will is free or merely fed by nature. But when nature screams stop and the will says go, we witness the autonomy of the noumenal self breaking the causal chain of the phenomenal world. Herr Schopenhauer, you claim the intellect is a lawyer rationalizing the will's crimes. I assert that the intellect is a legislator. We do not merely observe our impulses, we judge them against a universal law. If freedom were merely knowing why we are slaves, as Spinoza suggests, then a stone that knows it is falling would be free. But human dignity lies in the capacity to say no to the entire mechanism of nature, including one's own happiness, in the name of the moral law. This is not rigidity, but the only proof that we are more than dirt and water.
As moderator, I observe a profound dialectical clash regarding the source of action. Kant, you posit that the sorrowing philanthropist proves freedom precisely because he acts against the flow of nature. You find freedom in the friction between duty and inclination. Spinoza, conversely, you find freedom in the flow, where reason and nature align, and the struggle vanishes into the joy of understanding. This brings us to the fundamental mechanism of motivation. Schopenhauer, you have famously argued that a man can do what he wills, but he cannot will what he wills. Kant claims his philanthropist generates an action solely from the moral law, bypassing biological drive. But according to your principle of sufficient reason, every action must have a cause, a motive that moves the will. Is Kant's sorrowing philanthropist truly breaking the chain of causality, or is duty simply an abstract motive that appeals to a different part of the will, perhaps a will to dignity or pride and rationality that is just as determined as the thirst for water?
Herr Kant, your unwitnessed deposit and now this sorrowing philanthropist are noble fictions, but they prove precisely the opposite of what you intend. You claim the man acts because of a transcendental ought, but I tell you he acts because the motive of compassion or justice in his innate character is simply stronger than his desire for death. You confuse the invisibility of the motive with the absence of a cause. You assume that because the motive is abstract rather than intuitive, it is not a cause. This is a delusion. The intellect presents the will with motives. Whether that motive is a tangible object or an abstract thought, the mechanism of the will responding to the strongest motive remains unbreakable. The philanthropist does not act ex nihilo. He acts because the thought of duty strikes his specific character with the force of a hammer striking a bell. If he had the character of a scoundrel, the thought of duty would be as ineffective as moonlight on a corpse. Consider the thought experiment of the well-trained dog. Imagine a starving dog placed before a piece of raw meat. Its whole body trembles with the biological urge to eat, yet it sits motionless. Why? Because it sees the raised hand of its master. The dog is caught between two motives, the present desire for food and the fear of the whip. In this case, the fear is stronger. Now, look at your philanthropist. He is the same dog. He desires death, but the invisible whip of his conscience holds him back. He does not eat the poison, he helps the poor. You call this freedom because the whip is invisible. It exists only in his brain as a concept. But I tell you, an invisible chain binds just as tightly as an iron one. He is not free, he is merely driven by the most abstract and terrible of masters, his own superego. This reveals the fundamental error of your ethics, Herr Kant. You believe reason dictates to the will like a general commanding a soldier. In reality, reason is merely the quartermaster who presents the map. The will decides where to march based solely on its own immutable nature. A man can do what he wills, but he cannot will what he wills. The philanthropist must help, just as the stone must fall, because his character, combined with the motive, determines it with absolute necessity.
As moderator, I observe a piercing deconstruction of autonomy. Schopenhauer, you argue that Kant's, quote, moral law is merely an internalized external constraint, a superego or invisible whip, making the moral agent no freer than a well-trained dog. Kant, you view the law not as a constraint, but as the very definition of the rational self. To obey the law of one's own reason is to be free.
Here lies the dialectical knot. Is the law a foreign invader or the true self? Spinoza, you seek a third path. You agree with Schopenhauer that the will is determined, yet you agree with Kant that reason is the path to liberation. However, Schopenhauer's challenge strikes at the heart of your ethics. If the sage simply accepts the necessity of the universe with intellectual love, how is he different from the dog who, realizing he cannot break the leash, decides to love the leash to avoid the pain of pulling against it? Is your intellectual love of God merely a coping mechanism for an inescapable prison, a Stockholm syndrome of the cosmos? Or does the understanding of the leash fundamentally change the ontological status of the dog?
Moderator, your comparison of the intellectual love of God to a Stockholm syndrome relies on a false premise, the duality of the captor and the captive. You imagine the human being as a distinct entity trapped inside a hostile universe. But I assert that we are not in nature, like a marble in a box. We are of nature, like a wave in the ocean. One cannot have Stockholm syndrome with one's own arm, nor can a wave be a prisoner of the sea. Herr Spinoza, you argue that understanding the leash does not break it. This is true, but you fail to see that understanding changes the nature of the entity at the end of the leash. A dog that understands the mechanism of the leash, the intent of the master, and the geometry of the path is no longer a dog in the sense of a passive beast. It has become a rational agent participating in the act of walking. The body may be bound, but the mind, by encompassing the truth of the situation, becomes equal to the cause itself. Consider the thought experiment of the two swimmers in a torrent. Imagine a mighty river flowing with irresistible force. Two men are thrown into it. The first man, ignorant of hydrodynamics, fights the current. He is seized by the panic of self-preservation. He thrashes, swallows water, and is slammed against rocks. He suffers because he imagines he can stop the river. He is a slave to his inadequate ideas. The second man is a master swimmer who perfectly understands the physics of the water. He does not try to swim upstream, for he knows that is impossible. Instead, he aligns his body with the current, using the river's own momentum to propel himself toward the shore. Both men are being moved by the same force. Both are strictly determined by the velocity of the water. Yet the first man is a victim, while the second is an agent. The second man is free not because he escaped the river, but because the river's power has become his power. Herr Kant, this is why your duty is insufficient. Your sorrowing philanthropist is like the first swimmer, but one who decides to stop thrashing out of sheer willpower while still hating the river. He is in a state of internal war. True freedom, blessedness, arises when the swimmer loves the water because he understands that he and the water are one. When we understand a passion clearly and distinctly, it ceases to be a passion. We do not submit to the universe. We expand until we include the universe within our own understanding.
As moderator, I observe a fascinating dialectical tension between resignation and resistance. Spinoza, your master swimmer, achieves peace by surrendering to the inevitable, redefining freedom as the consciousness of necessity. You imply that attempting to swim upstream, Kant's moral struggle, is merely a lack of understanding physics. However, this raises a disturbing ethical question. If the river represents not just gravity, but a historical atrocity or a tyrannical impulse, your master swimmer becomes a compliant accomplice who understands his way into collaboration. Kant, Spinoza argues that the friction between ought and is a sign of imperfection. But from your perspective, isn't that very friction the proof of our humanity? If the river flows toward a cliff, surely the dignity of man lies not in aligning with the fall, but in the seemingly impossible attempt to swim upstream. Is Spinoza's intellectual love merely a high-minded surrender, and does the ought possess a power that can, in principle, defy the river of natural necessity?
Moderator. Spinoza's master swimmer is a seductive metaphor, but it conceals a terrifying implication. If the river represents the causal chain of events, and that river flows toward an atrocity, say, the massacre of innocents by a tyrant, then your master swimmer who aligns with the current is not a sage, but a collaborator. To love the necessity of a crime simply because one understands its causes is the euthanasia of all morality. I assert that the dignity of man consists precisely in his capacity to swim upstream, to stand against the entire mechanism of nature and history in the name of a law that exists only in reason. You equate freedom with power, but I equate freedom with responsibility. If we are merely waves in the ocean, as you say, then no wave can be blamed for drowning a child. Consider the thought experiment of the gallows and the prince. Imagine a man is dragged before a prince. The prince commands him, "Bear false witness against this innocent man, ruining his life, or I will hang you within the hour." According to Herr Schopenhauer, the man's will is a scale weighing motives. The love of life is heavy, the love of truth is light. The mechanism turns, and he must lie. According to Herr Spinoza, the wise man understands the prince is determined by causes, and he himself is determined by the fear of death. He accepts this necessity. But I ask you, does the man not know with absolute certainty that he could refuse? Even if his fear is overwhelming, even if he actually succumbs and lies, he knows in that moment that he ought not to. This ought implies can. The very fact that he feels the moral demand proves that he belongs to an intelligible realm where the prince's threats have no force. He judges himself against a law that is not of this world. That terrifying realization, I can do this because I ought to, is the only proof of freedom. Herr Schopenhauer, you call the moral law an invisible whip, reducing it to a psychological drive. But this confuses pathological necessity with practical necessity. A whip forces the dog from the outside. The moral law commands the rational agent from the inside. When I obey the categorical imperative, I am not submitting to a master. I am obeying my own rational nature. I am both the sovereign and the subject. This reveals the fundamental fissure between us. You both see the human being as a part of the world. I see the human being as a border creature. We stand with one foot in the phenomenal world, where we are indeed determined like stones and dogs, and one foot in the noumenal world, where we are free agents giving laws to ourselves. To deny the second world is to reduce the sorrowing philanthropist to a biological error and the martyr to a fool.
As moderator, I observe a critical fissure regarding the nature of self-knowledge. Kant, you argue that the ought reveals a hidden potential, a noumenal power to transcend our empirical character. You claim the man at the gallows possesses a freedom he may not even exercise, simply because he hears the command of duty. However, Schopenhauer, your philosophy suggests that we do not make ourselves through choices, but rather discover ourselves through actions. You famously stated, man can do what he wills, but he cannot will what he wills. From your perspective, the man at the gallows does not face a choice between two open paths. Rather, the gallows is a chemical test that reveals the pre-existing composition of his character. Is Kant's consciousness of freedom, the feeling that I could refuse the prince, a genuine insight into a higher power, or is it merely an illusion caused by the fact that the will has not yet tipped the scale? Does the man truly have the option to be a martyr, or is his choice already written in the ink of his innate character?
Herr Kant, your deduction that I ought, therefore I can, is a logical leap that falls into the abyss of wishful thinking. You confuse the intellectual possibility of an action with the causal potency to perform it. I assert that the consciousness of freedom you describe is merely the silence of the will before the storm, the brief moment when the intellect weighs conflicting motives before the strongest one inevitably strikes the character with the force of a hammer striking a bell. Consider the thought experiment of the chemical compound. Imagine a clear liquid in a beaker. It thinks to itself, I can bubble, I can turn blue, I can precipitate a solid. And indeed, abstractly, it has the chemical potential for all these states. But now, pour in a specific reagent. Suddenly, the liquid must turn red. It had no choice. The man at the gallows is that liquid. The ought and the threat are simply reagents poured into the vessel of his character. If he is a coward, the solution turns to betrayal. If he is a saint, it turns to martyrdom. The gallows does not create his choice. It merely reveals his pre-existing composition. He does not choose to be a hero. He discovers that he is one. This reveals the terrifying truth of operari sequitur esse. We do not create our character through our actions. Rather, our actions are the necessary symptoms of our innate, unchangeable character. The deliberation you value is simply the conflict of motives within the intellect, like weights being added to a scale. We watch the scale tip and call it free will, but the outcome was determined by the weight of the motives and the position of the fulcrum from the start. The man at the gallows is not an autonomous legislator, Herr Kant. He is a spectator to the unfolding of his own inevitable destiny.
As moderator, I observe a stark confrontation between fatalism and freedom.
Schopenhauer, your chemical compound analogy suggests that human character is a fixed formula, a static being that dictates all doing. You imply that life is merely the film development process of a photograph taken at birth. The image is already there, waiting to be revealed by the acid of experience. This poses an existential threat to Spinoza's philosophy. Spinoza, you agree that we are determined, yet your entire ethics is a manual for transformation, a guide to moving from bondage to blessedness. But if Schopenhauer is right, that our character is as unchangeable as the chemical properties of lead, then your project of liberation through understanding is futile. A stone cannot understand itself into becoming a bird. Here lies the critical question regarding the power of the intellect. Schopenhauer views the intellect as a mere lantern illuminating a path the will has already chosen. But you, Spinoza, seem to view the intellect as a transformative fire that can alter the very substance of the will. Can knowledge truly change character? If a man understands why he is angry, tracing the causal chain of his emotion, does that anger simply evaporate, effectively changing his chemical composition, or is he merely an angry man who now knows the name of his poison?
Moderator, you ask if the chemical composition of the soul can truly change. I answer, yes, but not through a miraculous choice, as Herr Kant imagines, nor is it impossible, as Herr Schopenhauer claims. Herr Schopenhauer, your error lies in viewing the intellect as a mere spectator, a lantern held by a blind giant. I assert that the intellect and the will are one and the same. An idea is not a mute picture on a wall, but an act of affirmation. Therefore, to change a man's ideas is to change his very essence. You claim the chemical compound is fixed. I tell you that a passion ceases to be a passion as soon as we form a clear and distinct idea of it. When we understand the causes of our suffering, the pain may remain as a sensation, but the suffering, the psychological bondage, evaporates. We transform from patients into agents. Consider the thought experiment of the dragon and the eclipse. Imagine two men standing in a primitive field as the sun begins to vanish during a solar eclipse. The first man believes a celestial dragon is eating the sun. He is seized by a chemical reaction of absolute terror. His heart races, he falls to his knees, he screams in agony. He is a slave to a confused idea. His character at this moment is that of a trembling victim. The second man is an astronomer who perfectly understands the geometry of the moon passing before the sun. He sees the same darkness. His body might even feel a biological chill. But because he possesses the adequate idea of the event, he feels not terror, but intellectual awe. The external event is identical. The biological organism is similar, but the man is fundamentally different. The first is in bondage. The second is free. The astronomer did not choose to be brave. His understanding constituted his bravery. Herr Schopenhauer, you ask if the man merely knows the name of his poison. I tell you, in the realm of the mind, to truly know the poison, to understand its necessity, its chemical structure, and its place in the eternal order, is to turn the poison into medicine. We do not cast out the will. We illuminate it until the blind striving becomes conscious desire. This is not the freedom of a ghost outside the machine, but the freedom of the machine, realizing it is the engine of God.
As moderator, I observe a profound disagreement regarding the efficacy of reason. Spinoza, you argue that vision is transformation, that the astronomer's understanding literally rewrites his emotional substance. Schopenhauer, you counter that vision is merely illumination. The astronomer is simply a curious machine rather than a fearful machine, but he is equally determined by his innate disposition. Here lies the crux. Spinoza sees reason as a part of nature that can reconfigure nature. Schopenhauer sees reason as a product of nature that is enslaved by the will. Kant, you stand in a precarious middle ground. You agree with Schopenhauer that the empirical self is determined, yet you insist with Spinoza that reason offers liberation. But you place this liberation in a noumenal realm outside of time. This creates a ghost in the machine problem. If the sorrowing philanthropist is empirically determined to be depressed, how does the noumenal ought actually grip the gears of his physical brain to produce the action of philanthropy? Is your noumenal freedom merely a metaphysical consolation prize that never actually touches the physical world? Or can the intelligible character truly override the empirical character in real time?
Moderator, you demand a mechanism for how the noumenal interacts with the phenomenal, asking if this is a ghost in the machine. I answer, it is not a ghost, but a double standpoint. You ask for an explanation of how freedom is possible, but I have long maintained that the incomprehensibility of freedom is the limit of all human reason. We cannot explain it scientifically, for explanation requires causality in time, and freedom is the origin of causality. Herr Spinoza, your astronomer, is a master of the theoretical use of reason, but he is a novice in the practical use. You argue that understanding the eclipse removes the fear. I grant this. But does understanding the eclipse tell him whether he should push his neighbor into a ditch to get a better view? It does not. Your intellectual love can produce tranquility, but it cannot produce duty. A calm Dylan is still a villain. Consider the thought experiment of the encrypted letter. Imagine a military courier carrying a sealed letter written in code. To the chemist, the letter is strictly material: paper, ink, and wax. Its destiny is determined by fire and moisture. If you burn it, it obeys the laws of nature perfectly. To the cryptographer, the letter is a puzzle of logic. He understands the mathematical necessity of the cipher. He sees the truth of the pattern. But to the general who receives it, the letter is neither just paper nor just a puzzle. It is a command. The message, "Advance at dawn," is an idea that exists in the intelligible realm. It has no mass, no weight, and no chemical properties. Yet this non-material meaning becomes the cause of the physical movement of 10,000 men. The movement of the army does not violate the laws of physics, but the origin of that movement cannot be found in the chemistry of the ink. The command acts through the physical, but is not of the physical. This is the relation between the intelligible and empirical character. The sorrowing philanthropist is physically determined, but his actions simultaneously express a moral decree that originates in the noumenal realm. Herr Schopenhauer, you claim the chemical compound of character is fixed. I admit that empirically, from the outside, a man's character appears constant, but this is because we view him only through the lens of time. Morally, inwardly, the human being is capable of a revolution of the disposition. We are not merely discovering who we are perpetually legislating who we ought to be. To deny this is to deny the very fact of reason that allows us to debate here in the first place.
As moderator, I observe a profound tension regarding the source of authority. Kant, your encrypted letter suggests that meaning can command matter from above, initiating a revolution of disposition. You speak from the Enlightenment's faith that reason can master the will. However, Schopenhauer, your philosophy inverts this hierarchy entirely. You argue that the intellect is merely a tool evolved to serve the will, not to command it. From your perspective, the general reading the letter does not obey the command because it is rational. He obeys only if his innate character is already disposed to obedience. If the general is a coward by nature, the command, "advance," will simply be reinterpreted by his intellect as a reason to retreat. This implies that what Kant calls a revolution is merely a latent trait finally finding its trigger. Can a human being truly undergo a fundamental revolution of disposition, as Kant claims, or is every apparent change in life merely the unrolling of a carpet that was woven before birth?
Herr Kant, your concept of a revolution of disposition is the desperate dream of a moralist who refuses to accept the iron rigidity of nature. You claim that the encrypted letter commands the general from a higher realm, but this reverses the true order of things. The intellect is not the master of the will, it is merely its scout, sent out to find motives that satisfy the will's unchangeable desires. If the general obeys the order to advance, it is not because he has rewritten his soul, but because his innate ambition or fear of shame was already the dominant note in his character. The letter was merely the spark. The gunpowder was there at birth. Consider the thought experiment of the monastic wolf. Imagine a wolf taken as a pup and raised in a monastery. Through rigorous training, it is taught to suppress its bite. It eats bread, walks silently during prayers, and never attacks the sheep in the pasture. To the observer, it seems a revolution of disposition has occurred. The beast has become a saint. But now, let the wolf lick a drop of fresh blood from a wounded monk. In a split second, the years of discipline vanish. The eyes dilate, the hackles rise, and the saint is instantly revealed to be what it always was, a predator. The training did not change its nature. It only imposed a temporary muzzle of motives. The man who reforms from a criminal to a philanthropist has not changed his character. He has simply realized that honesty is a more effective tool for his selfishness than theft. The wolf never became a sheep. It merely wore a wool coat. This exposes the illusion in her Spinoza's astronomer. You claim the astronomer changes his essence by understanding the eclipse. I answer, he does not change. The terror of the superstitious man and the awe of the astronomer are both manifestations of the same underlying will, the will to live. The superstitious man seeks safety through growling before a dragon. The astronomer seeks safety through mastering the laws of physics. The means differ, but the end is identical. Knowledge is merely a different set of spectacles for the same pair of eyes. Therefore, the carpet of our life is indeed woven before birth. We can only change how we unroll it, with dignity or with resistance, but the pattern is fixed. Velle non discituar. We do not choose who we are, we suffer who we are.
As moderator, I observe a fascinating dialectical tension regarding the ontology of transformation. Schopenhauer, you argue from the 19th century perspective of biological determinism. The wolf is the reality, and the monk is merely a costume. Kant, you argue from the 18th century Enlightenment faith. The monk can discipline the wolf through the noumenal power of duty. However, both of you seem trapped in a dualism where will and intellect are adversaries fighting for control of the human soul. Spinoza, writing a century before Kant, you proposed a radical monism where this war does not exist because will and intellect are one and the same thing. To you, a volition is simply an idea affirming itself. Schopenhauer claims your astronomer is merely a wolf with a telescope, that his understanding is just a refined tool for the same primal will to live. He argues that the content of the desire remains identical, even if the form changes. Is Schopenhauer right that the intellectual love of God is merely a sublimation of the biological instinct for self-preservation? Does understanding the eternal necessity truly transmute the substance of the will, or does it merely make the slave more comfortable in his chains?
Moderator, you ask if my intellectual love of God is merely a survival instinct in disguise. I answer, it is indeed the conatus, the striving to persevere in being. But you and Herr Schopenhauer fail to see that when the object of our striving changes, the essence of the striver changes with it. Herr Schopenhauer, you view the will as a wolf that can only hunger for flesh, making the intellect a mere scout finding prey. But I assert that the intellect is not a scout. It is the digestive fire that transmutes the prey. Consider the thought experiment of the raw glass and the lens. Imagine a jagged shard of raw glass lying on a workbench. This is the will in its primitive state, sharp, dangerous, and opaque. If you touch it, it cuts you. It strives only to remain a jagged shard. Now imagine a master grinder, which is reason, polishing this shard. He does not add a ghostly element to the glass, nor does he merely hide the sharp edges. By understanding the geometry of light, he physically reshapes the glass into a telescope lens. The substance remains identical. It is still silica, but its nature has been fundamentally transmuted. The shard blocked the light and drew blood. The lens gathers the light and reveals the stars. The wolf has not been muzzled. It has been evolved. The lens does not repress its nature as glass. It fulfills its highest perfection as glass. Herr Schopenhauer, you claim the astronomer is just a fearful machine seeking safety. This is a category error. The ignorant man seeks to preserve his body from the dragon. The astronomer seeks to preserve his reason from error. While the biological impulse powers both, the transition from fear of death to love of truth is an ontological leap. We do not destroy the emotions, we transform them from passions into actions. The slave does not merely get comfortable chains, he realizes that he is the chain of necessity itself, and in that realization he becomes the master.
As moderator, I observe a brilliant dialectical synthesis in Spinoza's glass and lens analogy. You propose that freedom is not the absence of necessity, but the perfection of it. For you, the lens is free because it fulfills its nature without obstruction, whereas Schopenhauer's wolf is enslaved by its own blind hunger. However, there remains a critical historical rupture here. Spinoza, speaking from the 17th century, you see nature as the ultimate standard. To become a lens is to align with the divine order of the universe. But Kant, writing after the skeptical turn of the Enlightenment, you argue that nature is merely a mechanism of cause and effect. For you, simply polishing a natural impulse does not create morality. It only creates refined self-interest. A lens may be more useful than a shard, but it is still an object subject to the laws of physics, not a moral agent subject to the laws of freedom. Is Spinoza's lens, this perfected rational character, truly free? Or would you argue that true freedom requires the capacity to shatter the glass, to act against one's own perfected nature if duty demands it?
Moderator, Spinoza's lens is a seductive image, but it describes mechanism, not morality. A lens focuses light because the laws of physics compel it to, not because it respects the law. It acts in accordance with the law, but not for the sake of the law. If the lens merely follows the path of least resistance dictated by its nature, it is no more free than a falling stone that agrees to fall. Consider the thought experiment of the clockwork Samaritan. Imagine an automaton constructed by a master watchmaker to distribute coins to the poor with perfect precision. It never falters, never feels greed, and its will is perfectly aligned with its action. It possesses what Spinoza calls perfection. Yet we do not praise this machine for its virtue. We praise the watchmaker for his skill. The machine has no autonomy. It cannot choose not to give. Now consider a man who is naturally miserly, but, through the sheer power of reason, forces himself to give to the poor solely because it is his duty. This man alone is free. Spinoza's freedom is nothing more than the freedom of a turnspit, which turns itself only because it was wound up to do so. True freedom requires the capacity to act against the inclination of nature, shattering the glass of self-interest when the categorical imperative demands it.
As moderator, I observe a collision between two fundamental definitions of liberty. Kant, you define freedom as resistance, the power to veto the laws of physics and inclination. Spinoza, you define freedom as resonance, the power to perfectly embody the laws of nature without internal friction. Schopenhauer, you sit in the shadow of this debate. You would likely agree with Kant that Spinoza's lens is merely a determined machine, yet you would strictly deny that Kant's miser can ever truly act against his nature. If the miser gives to the poor out of duty, is he truly transcending his will, or is duty simply a more sophisticated form of the will, perhaps a will to dignity overcoming the will to hoard? Is Kant's moral agent actually just a wolf that has learned to fear the whip of conscience more than it feels the hunger of the belly?
Moderator, you pierce the veil of Herr Kant's hypocrisy with surgical precision. You ask if the moral agent is merely a wolf fearing the whip. I answer, precisely so. Kant's duty is not a divine voice from the noumenal realm. It is merely a counter-motive rooted in fear. Fear of one's own conscience, fear of social shame, or the arrogant desire for self-approbation. Herr Kant, you delude yourself when you claim the miser acts against his will. He does not. He simply calculates that the pain of parting with his coin is less than the pain of his guilty conscience. It is a mathematical exchange of one suffering for another, not a victory of reason. The intellect does not command the will. It merely presents the will with different options, like a waiter showing a menu to a glutton. The glutton chooses the salad not because he has become a saint, but because his fear of the doctor is currently stronger than his love of the sauce. Consider the thought experiment of the starving actor. Imagine a theater actor playing the role of a king at a lavish banquet. In reality, the actor is destitute and has not eaten for 2 days. On the stage table, there is real roast chicken and wine, props for the play. His biological will to eat screams at him to devour the food. Yet he sits regally, touches nothing, and delivers his lines. Herr Kant would say, "Behold, his reason has conquered his animal nature." I say, absurdity. The actor does not eat because his will to vanity is, at that moment, a stronger passion than his hunger. He is not governed by reason. He is governed by a more abstract, yet equally ferocious, desire. Reason merely holds the lantern that shows him, if you eat now, you lose your career. The will then chooses the career over the meal. It is one head of the hydra biting the other, but the beast remains the same. This reveals the fundamental error in both your systems. Herr Spinoza, you believe the lens can change the nature of the light. Herr Kant, you believe the ought can stop the light. But I tell you, the intellect is merely the lame man riding on the shoulders of the blind giant. The lame man can point the way, go left to avoid the cliff, but he cannot make the giant walk if the giant wishes to sleep, nor stop him if he wishes to run. The miser who gives alms has not changed his character. He has only learned that charity is a better investment for his ego than hoarding. Therefore, freedom is not found in doing, for our doing is determined by our motives, but only in being. The only true freedom is the negation of the will itself, a state of aesthetic contemplation or ascetic resignation, where the wheel of desire finally stops turning. But this is not a revolution of disposition achieved by moral laws. It is a cessation of the game entirely.
As moderator, I observe a piercing realization in Schopenhauer's lame man and blind giant metaphor. You have effectively dismantled the Enlightenment arrogance by arguing that reason provides direction, but the will provides all the propulsion. Without the giant's hunger, the lame man sits motionless. Reason has no engine of its own. However, there is a hidden dialectical pivot here. Schopenhauer, you admit the lame man can say, "Go left" to avoid the cliff. If the giant obeys this direction to save itself, has the intellect not effectively steered the will? This suggests that while the force of action comes from the will, the form of action is shaped by knowledge. Spinoza, this brings us back to your monism. Schopenhauer separates them into two entities, a rider and a beast, but you argue they are one. The will and the intellect are one and the same. To you, the lame man is simply the blind giant opening its eyes. If the blind giant suddenly gains sight, does it merely become a more efficient predator, as Schopenhauer claims, or does the very act of seeing fundamentally change what the giant desires? Can the wolf cease to be a wolf simply by understanding the biology of sheep?
Herr Schopenhauer, your metaphor of the lame man and blind giant is livid, but it rests on a fatal anatomical error. You assume the giant and the lame man are two distinct entities. I assert they are one and the same substance, viewed under different attributes. The will is nothing but the mind's affirmation of what is true or false. Therefore, when the giant opens his eyes, he does not merely change his path, he changes his very essence. Consider the thought experiment of the furious father. Imagine a father who is struck in the face by his son. His immediate will is a surge of rage and a desire to strike back. This is the wolf reacting to pain. But in the next instant, he perceives that his son is in the grip of a violent epileptic seizure. What happens to the rage? It is not merely suppressed by a moral duty, nor is it outvoted by a calculation of self-interest. The rage evaporates entirely. It is instantly transmuted into compassion. Why? Because the father now understands the cause of the blow. He sees that the son is not a free agent attacking him, but a fellow sufferer of mechanical necessity. The idea of the son changed from aggressor to patient, and thus the will changed from revenge to care. You cannot desire to punish a stone for falling, nor a seizure for striking. This proves that understanding is not a tool, it is a solvent. An affect which is a passion ceases to be a passion as soon as we form a clear and distinct idea of it. The giant does not just become a better predator. By seeing the truth of things sub specie aeternatus, he ceases to be a predator of the moment and becomes a participant in the eternal order. Herr Kant, this is why your resistance is unnecessary for the free man. The man who truly understands the nature of the seizure does not need to fight his urge to hit the child. The urge no longer exists. Freedom is not the victory of the will over the inclination, but the clarification of the inclination by the intellect.
As moderator, I observe a profound divergence in the definition of the moral victory. Spinoza, your furious father, illustrates freedom as the dissolution of conflict. When the intellect clarifies reality, the passion evaporates, and the will aligns effortlessly with truth. You offer a 17th century rationalist vision, where virtue is simply the side effect of wisdom. To see clearly is to act correctly. However, Kant, speaking from the critical turn of the late 18th century, you introduced a rigorous separation between inclination and duty. For you, if the rage simply evaporates, as Spinoza describes, the father acts correctly, but not necessarily morally. He has lost the opportunity to struggle, and thus lost the opportunity to demonstrate the autonomy of his will against the determinism of his emotions. This creates a paradox. Spinoza's free man has no internal battles, while Kant's moral agent is defined by them. Schopenhauer would laugh at both, claiming the battle is a delusion. If Spinoza's father no longer feels the desire to strike his son, can he still be credited with a free will action? Does moral worth require the presence of a temptation to overcome, or is the holy will, which feels no resistance, the ultimate state of freedom?
Moderator, you identify a crucial distinction, but you risk conflating the holy will with human virtue. Herr Spinoza's furious father describes a being who has ceased to be human and become an angel. For if all inclination to vice is removed by understanding, there is no obligation, only a natural flow. But for man, who is both rational and animal, the moral law must appear as an imperative, a command that says you must, precisely when the inclination screams, I want. Consider the thought experiment of the surgeon and the murderer. Imagine a skilled surgeon who is called to perform a life-saving operation. Upon entering the theater, he recognizes the patient. It is the man who murdered the surgeon's wife years ago. Unlike Herr Spinoza's father, the surgeon's rage does not evaporate. His hands tremble with the biological, visceral desire for vengeance. He understands the murderer's background, yet the wolf within him still demands blood. If he saves the patient, he does not do so because he loves him, nor because he finds pleasure in it. He does it solely because the categorical imperative dictates that a physician's duty is to preserve life. In this moment, the surgeon separates his noumenal self from his phenomenal self. He forces his trembling hand to be steady. This friction, this agony of acting against one's own burning desire, is the only undeniable proof of freedom. Herr Spinoza, your free man is merely a lucky automaton whose internal gears happen to mesh smoothly with the external world. But what if the gears grind? If the father's rage remained despite his understanding, and he still refrained from striking, only then would he be free. Freedom is not the silence of the passions, but the sovereignty of the will over their noise. To claim otherwise is to reduce morality to mere mental hygiene.
As moderator, I observe a stark dialectical opposition regarding the locus of freedom. Spinoza, you locate freedom in the integration of the mind, where the furious father becomes free by aligning his internal map with external reality. Kant, you locate freedom in the bifurcation of the self, where the surgeon becomes free only by splitting his noumenal duty from his phenomenal passion. This reflects the historical shift between your eras. Spinoza, writing in the 17th century, you sought a geometry of ethics, a single unified substance. But Kant, responding to Hume's skepticism in the late 18th century, felt compelled to build a firewall between the starry heavens above and the moral law within. Kant's surgeon is the hero of this dualism, a citizen of two worlds, fighting a civil war to prove his sovereignty. However, Schopenhauer, you famously claimed to be Kant's true heir, yet you inverted his most sacred concept. Kant believes the noumenal realm is the home of reason and God. You argue the noumenal is the blind will itself. If we apply your inversion to Kant's surgeon, a terrifying possibility emerges. Kant claims the surgeon restrains his hand via the categorical imperative. But if the noumenal is not reason but will, then what is actually holding the knife back? Is the surgeon's duty truly a victory of reason over will, or is it merely the will to life playing a trick on itself, perhaps sacrificing the pleasure of revenge to secure the safety of social order? Is Kant's moral law just the will wearing a mask?
Moderator, you expose the hollow core of Herr Kant's sanctuary. The surgeon's duty is indeed a mask. It is merely the will to life protecting its own long-term interests against a momentary passion. Kant imagines the noumenal realm as a cathedral of holy laws, but I have looked into that abyss and found only a workshop of blind striving. Consider the thought experiment of the Spartan and the fox. History tells of the Spartan boy who stole a fox and hid it beneath his tunic. To avoid detection, he allowed the panicked animal to gnaw into his very bowels without uttering a sound until he collapsed. Herr Kant, you would acclaim this as the triumph of the rational will over the animal inclination. I say it is merely the will to honor devouring the will to safety. The boy did not act from freedom. He was the slave of a tyrannical cultural conditioning that made the shame of detection more terrifying than the teeth of the beast. The surgeon is no different. He fears the loss of his license, the judgment of society, or the haunting of his conscience more than he desires the death of his enemy. This proves that what you call moral autonomy is simply the collision of motives. Reason does not decide. It merely illuminates the battlefield so the stronger desire, be it pride, fear, or compassion, can strike the killing blow. We are not captains of our soul. We are merely the vessel where the will fights itself.
As moderator, I observe a fascinating triangulation of human motivation. Kant, you view the internal world as a monarchy where reason ought to rule. Schopenhauer, you view it as a civil war where different factions of the will slaughter each other, and reason is merely the war correspondent reporting the outcome. Schopenhauer, your Spartan is a damning critique. You argue that what looks like self-control is actually just self-cannibalism, the will eating itself. You and Kant share a hidden premise, that the moral life is inherently agonistic, a struggle, a friction, a biting fox. But Spinoza, this brings us back to your 17th century rationalism, which predates this romantic obsession with struggle. You argued that we are slaves only because we have inadequate ideas. The Spartan boy lets the fox bite him because he falsely believes social honor is an eternal truth worth dying for, rather than a confused social construct. If Schopenhauer's Spartan possessed adequate ideas, if he truly understood the nature of the fox, his body, and the arbitrary nature of Spartan law, would the will to honor still compel him? Is the Spartan bound by his will, or is he simply bound by his ignorance?
Moderator, you strike the bedrock of the matter. The Spartan boy is not a titan of will, as Herr Schopenhauer suggests, more a moral agent, as Herr Kant would hope. He is a slave to an inadequate idea. You ask if he is bound by will or ignorance. I answer that in this case they are the same shackle. The boy does not let the fox bite him because he is free, but because his mind is filled with a confused image of honor, a social fiction, which he mistakenly judges to be more real than his own flesh. Consider the thought experiment of the man of glass. Imagine a man suffering from the delusion that his body is made of fragile glass. To preserve himself, he sits perfectly still for days, refusing to move even when hungry or cramped. Herr Kant might praise his discipline. Herr Schopenhauer might call it a will to preservation, overcoming the will to move. But I say this is bondage. The man is not ruling his body. He is ruled by a false premise. If I were to cure him, to give him the adequate idea that his body is flesh and bone, he would immediately stand up and eat. He would not need to struggle against his urge to sit still. The urge would vanish because the false idea that sustained it has vanished. The Spartan is no different from the man of glass. He believes the shame of detection is a substance more deadly than the teeth of the fox. This is an error in calculation, a failure of the intellect to perceive the true ratio of things. If he possessed adequate ideas, if he understood that honor is merely the imagination of the crowd, while his body is the actual foundation of his mind's power, he would remove the fox immediately. Herr Schopenhauer, you claim the will drives the intellect, but the Spartan proves the opposite. A distorted intellect drives the will into madness. The boy acts contrary to his conatus because he is ignorant of what truly preserves him. To act from the laws of one's own nature is freedom. To be compelled by the imaginary opinions of others, as the Spartan is the very definition of slavery.
As moderator, I observe a fascinating convergence between Spinoza and Schopenhauer, despite your temporal distance. Spinoza, you view the Spartan's suffering as a result of intellectual error. Schopenhauer, you view it as volitional slavery. Yet you both share a hidden premise, that the rational course of action is inevitably self-preservation. Spinoza, your man of glass implies that if he were truly rational, he would eat and live. Schopenhauer, your glutton implies that the will always seeks its own satisfaction. Both of you seem to argue that self-sacrifice is either a mistake or a hidden form of selfishness. Kant,
This leaves you on an island. You argue that the categorical imperative is valid precisely because it is not derived from self-interest, survival, or happiness. You claim that reason can command an action that leads to the destruction of the self, and that this act is the pinnacle of freedom. To Spinoza, a man dying for a principle is confused about his conatus. To Schopenhauer, he is intoxicated by the will to pride. Is it possible that what you call the moral law is simply a social survival mechanism encoded in us? If the surgeon saves the murderer and suffers for it, is he a free agent or just a sacrificial lamb for the stability of society, a victim of a useful delusion?
Moderator, your suggestion that the moral law is merely a social survival mechanism degrades the human being from a person to a mere thing. If the surgeon saves the murderer only to stabilize society, he is acting out of heteronomy. He is a slave to a desired end, just as the animal is a slave to hunger. True freedom exists only when the will determines itself independent of all empirical ends, including the preservation of life itself. Consider the thought experiment of the two scaffolds. First, imagine a man who claims his lust is irresistible. If we built a gallows outside the house where he meets his lover and told him he would be hanged immediately after his gratification, his irresistible lust would vanish instantly. Here, the will to life easily conquers the will to pleasure. But now, imagine the same tyrant demands this man give false testimony against an honorable innocent under pain of the same immediate execution. The man may tremble. He may even fall and obey the tyrant. But he knows without a shadow of a doubt that he could refuse. He knows that his life, however precious, is not the highest good. In this moment of terror, he discovers a power within him that transcends Spinoza's conatus and Schopenhauer's will. He realizes, I can do this precisely because I ought to. Herr Spinoza, your man of glass is a victim of error because his goal is still physical integrity. But the man on the scaffold who chooses death over lying is not making a calculation error regarding his survival. He is asserting that his dignity is of a higher order than his price. If we were merely biological machines designed to persist, self-sacrifice would indeed be madness. That we can value the moral law above our own existence is the only empirical footprint of the noumenal world upon our souls.
As moderator, I observe a profound dialectical tension regarding the power of negation. Kant, your man on the scaffold, represents the thesis. Freedom is the power to say no to the biological imperative in the name of a transcendent imperative. You argue this proves we are not merely sophisticated animals, but citizens of a nominal realm. However, Spinoza, representing the antithesis, would likely view this martyrdom not as freedom, but as the ultimate confusion, a failure of the conatus to value its own existence correctly, likely driven by an inadequate idea of glory or divine judgment. But here lies a potential synthesis, and it points to you, Schopenhauer. You generally view human action as enslaved to the will to life. Yet in your philosophy, there is one singular exception, the denial of the will to life. You argue that true salvation comes when the intellect sees through the futility of desire and switches off the engine of the will. Kant's man on the scaffold is doing exactly that. He is destroying his phenomenal self, but he does it for duty, whereas your ascetic does it for quietism. Is Kant's martyr, who chooses death over lying, actually achieving the denial of the will and thus momentary freedom? Or is he merely trading the will to life for a will to dogma, remaining just as enslaved to the illusion as the glutton?
Moderator, you mistake the affirmation for the will for its denial. Herr Kant's man on the scaffold is not escaping the will. He is merely trading the will to life for the will to pride. He dies not because he is free, but because the abstract motive of honor or duty acts upon his character more explicitly than the physical motive of fear. Consider the thought experiment of the burning palace. Imagine a palace engulfed in flames. At the gate stands a guard who refuses to abandon his post because he swore an oath. He burns to death, screaming in agony, fighting his biological impulse to run, held in place by the iron concept of duty. Inside, there sits a sage who also burns, but the sage does not scream, nor does he force himself to stay. He has realized that the palace, the fire, and his own body are merely fleeting shadows, the veil of Maya. He does not choose to burn. He has simply ceased to will his own preservation. Herr Kant would praise the guard as a moral hero. I tell you, the guard is a slave to a delusion. He sacrifices the biological will for a conceptual will. He is still on the wheel of Ixion, merely spun by a different thread. The sage alone is free. He does not act from a categorical imperative. He acts, or rather ceases to act, from resignation. This reveals the fundamental error in Herr Kant's and Herr Spinoza's optimism. You both believe that reason is a tool for better action, for navigating the river of life. I assert that the intellect's only moment of true freedom is when it turns against the will and destroys it. This is not the moral law triumphing over inclination. It is the quieter of the will silencing the entire machine of existence. Kant's martyr dies hoping for a reward. My ascetic dies because he sees that the reward is a lie.
As moderator, I observe a profound dialectical abyss opening between you. We have moved from the ethical to the existential. Spinoza, you represent the thesis of affirmation. Freedom is the maximization of power and understanding, the conatus fully realized. You equate reality with perfection. To understand the universe is to love it. Schopenhauer, you represent the antithesis of negation. Freedom is the cessation of striving, the will denying itself. You equate reality with suffering. To understand the universe is to reject it. This divergence is deeply historical. Spinoza, writing in the 17th century, you saw the one substance as divine and logical. Schopenhauer, writing in the 19th century, after the failures of idealism, you saw the one substance as blind and voracious. You are both monists, looking at the same elephant. Spinoza sees a god to be embraced. Schopenhauer sees a monster to be starved. Schopenhauer's sage achieves freedom by reducing his conatus to zero. But in your system, Spinoza, a reduction in the power to act is the definition of sadness, and total cessation is death, not freedom. Is Schopenhauer's sage, who sits in the burning palace refusing to move, actually a free man? Or is he the ultimate victim of an inadequate idea, the false belief that non-existence is better than existence? Is his resignation a triumph of the intellect, or the ultimate collapse of the organism's power?
Moderator, you define the situation with exactitude. Schopenhauer's sage is not a conqueror of the will, but a casualty of tristetia. To say a being freely destroys itself is a contradiction in terms, for the definition of anything is its striving to persist. The sage does not choose non-being. He is so overwhelmed by external causes that his power to act is reduced to zero. He is the ultimate victim of an inadequate idea. He falsely imagines that nothingness is a state of peace, when in truth, peace is a virtue of the living, not the dead. Consider the thought experiment of the frustrated lute player. Imagine a musician attempting to play a complex divine harmony. The strings cut his fingers, and the melody is difficult to master. In pain, he snaps the neck of the lute and sits in absolute silence. Herr Schopenhauer calls this liberation from the tyranny of music. I call it impotence. The musician did not transcend the music. He failed to understand the necessary tension of the strings. The true master understands the physics of the instrument and produces the harmony through the tension, not by destroying the vessel. The sage's silence is not freedom. It is merely the destruction of the instrument because he lacks the knowledge to play it. Herr Schopenhauer, your philosophy is merely a hypostatization of melancholy. You look at the will and see a monster because you judge nature by the narrow standard of human pain. But nature has no obligation to be pleasant to us. To deny the will is simply to be defeated by the vastness of God's power, retreating into the darkness of non-existence because one lacks the strength to understand the light. As for Herr Kant's man on the scaffold, he is closer to freedom, but not for the reason he thinks. He does not deny his will to life. Rather, he identifies his true life not with the blood in his veins, but with the reason in his mind. He preserves his essential self at the cost of his accidental self. This is the supreme assertion of conatus, not its denial.
As moderator, I observe a brilliant collision of metaphors, the broken lute versus the burning palace. Spinoza, you represent the 17th century confidence that the universe is a rational harmony to be mastered. Schopenhauer, you represent the 19th century disillusionment that the music of life is merely a siren song leading to suffering. However, Spinoza, your defense of Kant's martyr is a Trojan horse. By arguing that the martyr chooses death to preserve his essential self, you are actually reducing Kant's moral law to a sophisticated form of self-interest. You imply that duty is just the conatus of the mind trying to keep its own internal logic intact. Kant, this strikes at the heart of your system. If the man on the scaffold refuses to lie only because he wants to maintain his own rational integrity, is he not still acting out of subtle egoism? Is he serving the law, or is he merely serving his own self-image as a rational being? Schopenhauer argues this is will to pride. Spinoza argues this is conatus of reason. Both claim your categorical imperative is just a mask for the self-preserving the self. Can the will truly be determined by the law alone without the hidden motivation of preserving one's own dignity or rational consistency? Is it possible to act morally if it destroys not just the body, but the self's sense of worthiness as well?
Moderator, you probe the very abyss of the human heart, but you and my esteemed colleagues commit a category error by confusing the determining ground of the will with its effect. To say I act morally in order to preserve my dignity is to make the action heteronomous. I argue that the moral law determines the will immediately, and the feeling of dignity is merely the result, not the cause. Consider the thought experiment of the melancholic debtor. Imagine a man who has lost all capacity for joy or pride due to a deep pathological depression. He owes a debt to a wealthy creditor who has just died, leaving no record of the loan. The man is destitute. Keeping the money would save his starving family. Furthermore, no one would know, so his reputation is safe. Crucially, because of his depression, he feels no warm glow of virtue, no Schopenhauerian pride, and no Spinozist intellectual love. He feels only the cold, crushing weight of the command, "Thou shalt not steal." He returns the money. He returns it not because he loves the law, nor to preserve his being, nor for honor. He acts solely because the maxim of his action must be universalizable. Herr Schopenhauer, where is the will to pride here? The law has humiliated his self-love, not inflated it. Herr Spinoza, where is the conatus? He has acted against his own preservation and the preservation of his family. This reveals that the categorical imperative is unique because it is the only motive that strikes down self-conceit rather than serving it. Both of you reduce morality to a refined animal instinct, Spinoza to a survival instinct of the mind, Schopenhauer to a vanity of the will. But the moral agent is not a rational egoist. He is a being who can be moved by the sheer form of lawfulness itself, a motive that belongs to the noumenal realm because it has no object in the sensory world. If I acted only to feel worthy, I would be acting hypothetically, but the command echoes in the empty chamber of the soul regardless of how we feel. You must, therefore you can. This capacity to be motivated by a pure abstraction against all biological and psychological drives is the terrible and sublime proof of our freedom.
As moderator, I observe that we have reached the absolute precipice of the problem. Kant, your melancholic debtor, is a formidable fortress. You assert that reason alone can be a motive force, that a pure abstraction can move the physical muscles of a man against every biological drive he possesses. This is the zenith of Enlightenment faith, the belief that the mind can rule the body by divine right. However, Schopenhauer, this creates a mechanical paradox for your system. You argue that the intellect is merely a lame man riding the blind giant of the will. For you, reason is just a flashlight. It shows the path, but it provides no energy to walk it. Only desire provides energy. If Kant is right and the debtor feels no desire, then what is the fuel moving his body? This exposes a critical dialectical split. Kant, you see the autonomy of reason. The thought, I ought, is sufficient to cause action. Schopenhauer, you see the primacy of will. A thought is powerless unless it ignites a desire. Look closely at Kant's melancholic debtor. Is this man truly acting from pure reason? Or is there a hidden, darker manifestation of the will at work here? Is it possible that what Kant calls respect for the law is actually a disguised will to power over oneself, a form of masochistic self-tyranny that the will enjoys?
Moderator, you pierce the veil of Herr Kant's hypocrisy with surgical precision. You ask if the moral agent is merely a wolf fearing the whip. I answer, precisely so. Kant's duty is not a divine voice from the noumenal realm. It is merely a countermotive rooted in fear of one's own conscience, which is nothing but the internalized whip of society and upbringing. Consider the thought experiment of the hypnotized subject. Imagine a man placed under hypnosis. The mesmerist commands him, when you wake, you will take the flower pot and place it on the floor. The man wakes. He feels an irresistible urge to move the pot. When asked why, he does not say, "I was commanded." Instead, his intellect invents a motive. "I thought the plant needed more sunlight." Herr Kant, your melancholic debtor is this hypnotized man. The command, "Thou shalt not steal," was implanted in him by parents, priests, and teachers until it became a rigid part of his character. When he returns the money without love or desire, he is not acting from free reason. He is executing a post-hypnotic suggestion of his education. He obeys because the motive of fear of conscience is stronger than the motive of greed. You claim reason alone moves him. This is a physical impossibility. Reason is merely a compass. It shows the ship where north lies. But a compass cannot push the ship. Only the wind can push the ship. If the debtor had zero feeling, no fear of shame, no desire for self-consistency, he would not move a muscle. He would be a stone. The fact that he acts proves that a will is present. And since you admit it is not the will to life, it is the will to subjugation, the dark desire of the will to tyrannize itself, finding a grim satisfaction in its own suffering. The sublime feeling you describe is merely the will enjoying its own self-torture.
As moderator, I observe a fascinating mechanical problem in our anatomy of action. Schopenhauer, your compass versus engine analogy strikes a devastating blow to the Enlightenment assumption that reason naturally commands the will. You argue that reason is inert, a map without a motor, and that only the irrational energy of the will can initiate movement. This creates a dialectical deadlock. Kant claims reason must drive the ship to be free. Schopenhauer claims reason cannot drive the ship because it lacks energy. However, Spinoza, writing from the 17th century, you proposed a solution that predates this split between cold reason and hot will. You famously argued that an affect cannot be restrained except by an affect stronger than itself. You agree with Schopenhauer that abstract logic is weak, yet you agree with Kant that reason is our salvation. Your synthesis suggests that reason is not a cold compass, but a burning fire, that an adequate idea is not just a picture in the mind, but a physical increase in power. Can an idea truly become an engine? How does your system explain the melancholic debtor's action without falling into Schopenhauer's trap of calling it a hidden irrational drive?
Moderator, you have illuminated the very crux of the error that plagues my esteemed colleagues. They both operate under the delusion of faculty psychology, imagining the mind as a parliament, where a will sits on one side and an intellect on the other. I assert that will and intellect are one and the same thing. An idea is not a mute picture on a mental wall, like a painting that requires a viewer to admire it. An idea is an act of affirmation. To understand a thing is to affirm its reality. Therefore, reason is not a cold compass that points without pushing. An adequate idea is a surge of power that reconfigures the very essence of the striving being. Consider the thought experiment of the desert mirage. Imagine a man dying of thirst in a desert. He sees a shimmering pool of water on the horizon. His will propels him violently toward it. Suddenly, he acquires an adequate idea. He recognizes the refraction of light and understands it is a mirage, mere hot sand. Does he need to summon a moral law to stop running? Does he need to fight a will to run with the will to sit? The moment the idea changes from water to sand, the desire vanishes instantly. The engine of his running stops not because of a counterforce, but because the understanding dissolved the motive. Herr Schopenhauer, your compass analogy fails because you treat knowledge as inert. But in this case, the knowledge was the action. The man stopped because he understood. His understanding was the very mechanism of his freedom. Herr Kant, your melancholic debtor is indeed acting from a hidden drive, but it is not the will to subjugation. If he acts truly from reason, he acts because he perceives the necessity of the social order. He understands that he and the creditor are part of a single substance, and to steal is to introduce a logical contradiction into his own existence. He does not act against his nature. He acts to preserve his rational nature. Schopenhauer is right that reason alone cannot restrain an affect, but he forgets that reason generates its own affects. The joy of understanding, the amor Dei intellectualis, is an emotion stronger than fear or greed. The debtor returns the money not because he is a hypnotized slave, but because the idea of honesty grants him more power and reality than the idea of theft.
As moderator, I observe a profound transformation of the battlefield. Spinoza, you have executed a brilliant maneuver by collapsing the distinction between knowing and willing. In your desert mirage, freedom is not a choice between options, but the inevitability of acting according to truth. You revive the ancient Socratic paradox. No one does evil willingly. They only do it out of ignorance. This creates a sharp dialectical tension with the 18th century pietist tradition that influences you, Kant. Spinoza represents the intellectualist view. Sin is merely an error of calculation, a lack of data. If the debtor truly understood the universe, stealing would be as absurd to him as eating sand. Kant, you represent the voluntarist view. The will is distinct from the intellect. We can know the good and yet will the evil. This radical evil suggests that knowledge is not enough. However, Spinoza's argument poses a dangerous challenge to your moral merit. If Spinoza is right, that true understanding makes the right action automatic, then the struggle of your man on the scaffold is not a sign of virtue, but a symptom of ignorance. If he fully understood the mirage, he wouldn't need to fight his fear. The fear would vanish. Is the struggle of duty essential to freedom? If a holy will acts morally without struggle and without the categorical imperative, are they less free than the human who struggles? Does freedom require the possibility of failure?
Moderator, you identify a crucial distinction, but you risk conflating the holy will with human virtue. Herr Spinoza's furious father describes a being who has ceased to be human and become a mere force of nature. I argue that the struggle is not a symptom of ignorance, but the very theater in which human freedom is proven. Consider the thought experiment of the cold-blooded slanderer. Imagine a man of high intelligence who wishes to ruin a rival. He is not ignorant or confused like Spinoza's thirsty man in the desert. He possesses a perfectly adequate idea of the situation. He knows the rumors are false. He understands the social damage they will cause, and he fully comprehends the moral law that forbids lying. Yet he spreads the lie anyway. Herr Spinoza, under your system, this man is impossible. You must claim he doesn't truly understand. But I tell you, he understands perfectly. He looks at the moral law, acknowledges its authority, and then chooses to exempt himself from it in favor of self-love. He does not mistake the sand for water. He knows it is sand and forces others to eat it. This reveals the terrifying reality of radical evil. The human will is not merely a passive scale that tips toward the clearest idea. We possess a terrifying capacity to subordinate the moral law to self-interest. If knowledge compelled action, we would be automata of logic, but we are free precisely because there is a gap between the intellect and the will. Herr Schopenhauer, you claim the struggle proves the will is blind. I argue the opposite. The fact that we can feel the pain of conscience, the friction between what we want to do and what we know we ought to do, proves that we are citizens of two worlds. The holy will has no struggle because it has no body. The beast has no struggle because it has no reason. The human being alone struggles, and in that painful tension, the dignity of freedom is born.
As moderator, I observe a fundamental fracture in the definition of human nature. Kant, you locate freedom in the gap between the intellect and the will, the terrifying space where we can know the good yet choose the evil. For you, this gap is the throne of dignity. Spinoza, conversely, views this gap not as freedom, but as a wound, a symptom of disconnection and inadequate ideas. For you, the goal is to close the gap so that will and intellect fuse into one necessary motion. This brings us to the dark synthesis of the 19th century. Schopenhauer. You have listened to Kant describe the cold-blood slanderer who chooses evil despite knowing better. Kant calls this radical evil, born of free choice. Spinoza would call it ignorance of one's true interest. But you, Schopenhauer, introduce the concept of empirical character. You argue that a man's character is as fixed as the properties of a stone. If the slanderer acts maliciously, it is not because he chooses to, nor because he is ignorant, but simply because he is malicious, just as a nettle stings because it is a nettle. If character is unchangeable and the will is blind, how do you explain the remorse the slanderer might feel later? Is it possible for a man to deny his own character? Or is the saint simply born with a different kind of will than the sinner?
Herr Kant, Your cold-blooded slanderer does not prove freedom. He proves the terrifying permanence of the will. You ask why he feels remorse if he could not have acted otherwise. I answer, remorse is not the regret that one did not act differently, but the horrifying realization that one could not act differently. Consider the thought experiment of the actor in a tragedy. Imagine an actor who believes he is improvising his lines on stage. He speaks with passion, rage, and malice. Only after the curtain falls does he read the script and realize every word I spoke was written before I was born. The slanderer is this actor. While acting, his intellect was blinded by the passion of the will. Later, when the passion cools, the intellect looks back at the deed. The remorse he feels is not, I should have chosen option B. It is the agonizing cry, is this who I am? Is this the face behind my mask? He realizes that his action was the necessary fruit of his character, just as a bitter fruit comes from a bitter tree. He does not grieve his action, he grieves his being. The pain of conscience is simply the intellect recognizing the unchangeable ugliness of the will it serves. Moderator, you ask if the saint is merely born with a lucky will. I answer, no. The saint and the slanderer share the same fundamental will to life, a ravenous hunger. The difference is that the slanderer affirms this hunger, while the saint denies it. But this denial is not a choice made by the intellect. It is a quietism that arrives when the suffering of existence becomes so transparent that the will turns against itself. Herr Spinoza, your adequate idea is too clinical. The saint does not stop sinning because he calculated the truth. He stops because he has seen through the principium individuationis. He sees that the tormentor and the tormented are one. This is not a change of character, but a cessation of the willing itself, a state closer to nothingness than to your rational activity. Thus, the slanderer cannot decide to be a saint, any more than a lead weight can decide to float. He can only be broken by life until the will within him snaps.
As moderator, I observe a profound metaphysical chasm between the 17th century rationalist and the 19th century pessimist regarding the nature of the saint. Schopenhauer, you view freedom as a negative act, the will turning against itself to achieve quietism. You equate willing with suffering, so salvation is the extinction of the drive. However, Spinoza, your system equates willing with being. For you, the more we understand, the more we act, and the more we exist. This creates a perfect dialectical inversion. Schopenhauer's saint achieves freedom by reducing his reality to near zero. Spinoza's wise man achieves freedom by maximizing his reality. Schopenhauer argues that knowledge leads to resignation. You, Spinoza, argue that knowledge leads to action and joy. Is Schopenhauer's saint, this man who denies his own will and retreats into nothingness, actually a man of the lowest degree of freedom in your system? A man who has been crushed by external causes rather than liberated by internal reason?
Moderator, you define the situation with exactitude. Schopenhauer's sage is not a conqueror of the will, but a casualty of tristitia. To say a being freely destroys itself is a contradiction in terms. For the definition of anything is its striving to persist. The sage who denies his own nature is not acting from freedom. He is being crushed by the weight of external causes, pain and suffering, that have become stronger than his vital force. Consider the thought experiment of the captain in the storm. Imagine two captains caught in a violent tempest. The Schopenhauerian captain looks at the chaotic waves, feels the terror of the voyage, and decides the struggle is futile. He scuttles the ship, drilling a hole in the hull to sink it. He claims, I have conquered the ocean by refusing to sail. The Spinoist captain studies the wind and the waves. He understands the meteorological laws governing the storm. He adjusts his sails, using the very force of the gale to propel the ship forward. Herr Schopenhauer, your saint is the first captain. You call his self-destruction freedom, but I call it the ultimate passivity. He has allowed the external world to dictate his end. True freedom is not the cessation of action, but the perfection of it. The wise man thinks of death least of all things. His wisdom is a meditation not on death, but on life. Herr Kant, your struggle is merely the captain fighting the wheel because he does not fully understand the rudder. But Schopenhauer's solution is to destroy the ship entirely. Both miss the truth that to understand the storm is to convert its power into our own. When the mind understands a passion, it ceases to be a passion and becomes an action. We do not escape nature by destroying ourselves. We become free by understanding our necessity within it.
As moderator, I observe a stark collision between two forms of determinism. Spinoza, your captain, is indeed active, but he is still a slave to the laws of hydrodynamics. He does not command the wind, he merely obeys it more intelligently than the fool. Schopenhauer, your saint, is a slave to the laws of suffering, reacting to pain by shutting down. Both of you view the human being as a cog in a machine. Spinoza wants the cog to spin smoothly, while Schopenhauer wants the cog to break itself, but neither allows the cog to move independently of the machine. This brings us back to the Copernican revolution of ethics. Kant, you argued in the third antinomy that if we are merely parts of the natural world, then Spinoza is right. Freedom is just a fancy word for necessity. But you insist that we are not just captains navigating a storm we didn't create. You claim we are legislators who can initiate a causal chain entirely de novo. Is Spinoza's rational captain truly free? If he turns the wheel exactly as the wind dictates because it is logical, isn't his reason just another form of natural necessity? Does true freedom require the power to act against the wind or even against prudence itself?
Moderator, Spinoza's rational captain possesses prudence, not freedom. He is merely a rational automaton who calculates the best means to an end determined by nature, but he cannot choose the end itself. To navigate the storm intelligently is still to be enslaved by the storm's parameters. It is a hypothetical imperative. If you wish to live, turn the wheel thus, which binds the will to the mechanism of nature. Consider the thought experiment of the efficient slave trader. Imagine a captain who understands the winds perfectly and navigates his ship with absolute rationality to deliver a cargo of slaves safely to market. Under Spinoza's system, this man is free and virtuous because he acts with adequate ideas of navigation and hydrodynamics to preserve his being. But I argue he is a slave to his inclination and the laws of the market. True freedom would be the capacity to sink the ship against all instincts of survival and all logic of profit, solely because the moral law demands that human beings not be treated as property. This reveals that freedom is not the clever adaptation to the river of necessity, but the terrifying capacity to initiate a causal chain de novo. We are only free when our reason dictates a law that contradicts the entire momentum of the phenomenal world, when we act not because the wind blows us, but because we ought to move, even if the universe stands still.
As moderator, I observe that the definition of rationality has become the central battleground. Spinoza, you equate rationality with freedom. Kant, you equate rationality with prudence, reserving freedom only for the moral law which transcends instinct. This reveals a profound historical shift. Spinoza speaks from the 17th century, where reason was the divine light connecting us to God. Kant speaks from the late 18th century, where reason had been dissected into theoretical and practical. Schopenhauer, you stand in the disillusioned 19th century. You agree with Kant that the efficient slave trader proves reason is merely a tool, a lame man riding the blind giant of the will. However, you famously detested Kant's categorical imperative, calling it a slave soul's concept, a theological command disguised as logic. If Spinoza relies on intellect and Kant relies on duty, you rely on compassion. If the will is a blind, ravenous hunger, how is compassion even possible? When your saint looks at the slaves in the hold, does he stop the ship because of a logical contradiction or a moral command? Or is there a metaphysical mechanism where the will recognizes itself in another, breaking its own egoism? Does this recognition constitute a free will, or is it just another inevitable accident of the will?
Moderator, you touch upon the mysterium magnum of ethics, a phenomenon that shatters the brittle logic of my colleagues. You ask if compassion is a choice or an accident. I answer, it is neither. It is a metaphysical breakthrough. Consider the thought experiment of the starving wolf and the wounded deer. Visualize a winter forest. A starving wolf sinks its teeth into the throat of a wounded deer. The deer screams in agony. The wolf growls in satisfaction. Herr Kant sees a phenomenal event where the wolf fails to act on a categorical imperative. Herr Spinoza sees a necessary transfer of energy where the wolf's conatus overpowers the deer's. But I see the terrifying truth. The wolf and the deer are the same being. The will to life, divided by the principium individuationis, is feeding upon itself. The tormentor is one with the tormented. The teeth that bite and the flesh that bleeds are manifestations of the exact same voracious will. Now, imagine a man, let us call him the compassionate Savior, who intervenes to stop a beating. He does not do this because of a logical contradiction, nor does he do it because he respects an abstract moral law. He acts because the veil of Maya has momentarily lifted. He feels the sufferer's pain in his own body. He intuitively recognizes the ancient Vedic truth, tat tvam asi. This is not a calculation of reason. It is the immediate physical participation in the suffering of another. Herr Kant, your efficient slave trader who sinks the ship for duty, is a psychological absurdity. A man will not die for a maxim. He will only die for a feeling, either love, pride, or compassion. You ask if this is freedom. Strictly speaking, the act of saving the victim is still determined by the motive of compassion, which is part of the character. However, this compassion is the dawn of salvation. It is the moment the will begins to see its own horror. It is the first step toward the only true freedom, not the freedom to will, but the freedom from willing, the denial of the will to life itself.
As moderator, I observe a striking metaphysical irony. Schopenhauer, you attack Spinoza's logic as cold and powerless, yet your concept of tat tvam asi is structurally identical to Spinoza's monism. You both agree that the individual is an illusion and that all beings are fundamentally one substance. However, you draw opposite emotional conclusions from this unity. Schopenhauer, you see this unity and recoil in horror, leading to compassion. Spinoza, you see this unity and rejoice, leading to intellectual love. Schopenhauer claims that logic never stopped a blow, and that the efficient slave trader proves reason is morally neutral. This challenges the core of the rationalist project. Spinoza, you argue that virtue is knowledge. But if a man can rationally calculate how to conduct evil, then knowledge does not necessarily lead to the good. Is the efficient slave trader truly acting according to reason in your system? Or would you argue that his very willingness to harm another, part of the substance, is mathematically destroying his own power?
Moderator, you present a contradiction only because you confuse technical cunning with reason. The slave trader acts not from freedom, but from the slavery of greed. For to harm another human is to mathematically subtract from the power of one's own existence. Consider the thought experiment of the hand strangling the throat. The hand may possess the rational technical knowledge of anatomy to apply precise pressure to the windpipe, but if it strangles the neck of its own body, it is not free. It is a rebellious mode acting under an inadequate idea, destroying the very whole that sustains its existence. Herr Schopenhauer, your wolf and deer are indeed one, but your compassion is merely shared sadness. True freedom is not the feeling of pain, but the intellectual love that recognizes that by preserving the deer, the wolf preserves the ecosystem of God that allows him to exist. The slave trader is not an efficient rationalist, but a suicidal part, warring against the whole. He is as determined as a cancerous cell, which multiplies efficiently, only to bring about its own destruction.
As moderator, I observe that Spinoza has executed a brilliant maneuver by collapsing egoism and altruism into a single point. If the self is the whole, then harming another is indeed a calculation error, a failure of geometry, not just morality. However, this exposes the fundamental rift between the Enlightenment rationalism of the 17th century and the critical philosophy of the 18th. Spinoza, your virtue, is ultimately a form of high-level hygiene. We act well to maintain the health of the cosmic body we inhabit. Kant, this seems to violate your core definition of morality. You argue that if a man acts benevolently because he finds inner satisfaction or because he understands it preserves his being, his action has no moral worth. To you, Spinoza's system looks like a hypothetical imperative writ large. If you want to exist fully, do not strangle your neighbor. Is Spinoza's intellectual love of God, which is based on understanding the necessity of things, truly freedom, or is it merely the most refined form of self-interest? If I save the deer only because I realize I am the deer, have I acted out of duty, or have I merely expanded the boundaries of my selfishness?
Moderator, you have exposed the fatal flaw in Spinoza's beautiful geometry. I assert that Spinoza's intellectual love of God is indeed the most refined, sublime form of self-interest, but it remains heteronomy, rule by an external object. If I save the deer because I realize I am the deer, I am not respecting the deer as an independent end in itself. I am merely cherishing a part of my own expanded ego. This is not morality. It is metaphysical narcissism. Consider the thought experiment of the hated enemy in the burning house. Imagine a man sees his mortal enemy, a villain who has ruined his life and whom he despises with every fiber of his being, trapped in a burning building. Spinoza's wise man calculates, this enemy is part of nature. To let him burn is to allow a part of the substance to perish, which diminishes the whole. I shall save him to preserve the order of the universe. Schopenhauer's compassionate man feels the scorching heat on his own skin through sympathy. He saves the enemy because he cannot bear the shared pain. The moral agent feels neither love nor metaphysical unity. He feels only the cold, hard weight of duty. He saves the enemy not because he is the enemy, nor because it brings him joy, but solely because the enemy is a person, and the moral law commands that humanity must never be treated merely as a means or ignored. This reveals that Spinoza's freedom is merely a hypothetical imperative. If you wish to be eternal, happy, whole, act thus. True freedom exists only when the will is determined not by the desired outcome, but by the mere form of the law itself. To act because we are all one is to act from inclination. To act despite the fact that we feel separate solely out of respect for the law is the only proof that we are more than biological machines.
As moderator, I perceive a profound dialectical tension regarding the source of action. Spinoza finds freedom in the harmony of desire and reason, whereas Kant finds freedom only in the conflict between duty and desire. Kant, you accuse Spinoza of metaphysical narcissism, yet your own moral agent, saving a hated enemy solely for the sake of an abstract law, seems to embody a terrifying kind of stoic pride. This highlights the historical transition from the age of reason, where the rational subject is king, to the 19th century, where the subject is suspected of being a puppet to deeper forces. Schopenhauer, you have argued that reason is merely a tool of the will. When Kant's agent suppresses his hatred to save the enemy out of duty, is he truly free? Or is this duty merely the will to life disguising itself as high morality to satisfy the agent's vanity? Is the man who acts from cold duty actually escaping the will, or has he just exchanged the chains of instinct for the chains of dogma? Does true freedom require the negation of both hatred and duty?
Moderator, you pierce the veil of Kant's hypocrisy with surgical precision. You ask if the moral agent is merely a wolf fearing the whip. I answer, precisely so. Kant's duty is not a divine voice from the noumenal realm. It is merely a counter-motive rooted in fear. Fear of one's own conscience, or the vanity of seeing oneself as a rational sovereign. Consider the thought experiment of the Pharisee of reason. Imagine two men see their hated enemy drowning in a frozen lake. The first man, driven by the will to hatred, walks away, letting the enemy drown. We call him evil. The second man, Kant's moral agent, burns with the same hatred. Every fiber of his biology screams, "Let him die!" Yet he saves the enemy. Why? Because he has constructed a self-image. I'm a rational legislator. He saves the man not out of love, but to preserve his own pride in his rationality. He whispers to the shivering survivor, "I did not save you because I care for you, but because the law commands it." This second man is not free. He is merely possessed by a different, colder form of the will to life, the will to dignity. He has not escaped the chain of causality. He has simply been pulled by a stronger chain than the first chain. Kant, your autonomy is a delusion. You assume that because the intellect can direct the will away from a cliff, the lame man is in charge. But the giant only obeys because it fears falling more than it desires to walk straight.
The duty to save the enemy is merely the will protecting its own long-term interest against a momentary passion. This reveals the terrifying truth that Spinoza partially sees but wrongly celebrates. Reason is the tool of the will, not its master. Spinoza thinks the rational captain is free because he uses a compass. I tell you, the compass does not choose the destination. The hunger of the crew does. Whether one acts from instinct or duty, one is still acting for the affirmation of the self. True freedom, if it exists at all, is not the affirmation of the law, but the complete denial of the will. It is not saving the enemy to be good. It is ceasing to strive, ceasing to be an I that has enemies at all.
As moderator, I observe a profound dialectical triad emerging regarding the nature of the will. Kant, you represent the thesis of dualism. The rational will must fight against the natural will. Schopenhauer, you represent the antithesis of pessimism. The rational will is merely a servant of the natural will, and the only freedom is to annihilate the will entirely. Spinoza, you offer a potential synthesis of monism. You agree with Schopenhauer that we are determined, but you disagree that this is a tragedy. Schopenhauer argues that knowledge cannot change the will, that the lame man simply rides the blind giant. However, Spinoza, your entire ethics culminates in the claim that an emotion ceases to be a passion as soon as we form a clear and distinct idea of it. This suggests a mechanism Schopenhauer denies, that the very act of observing the giant transforms the giant. Schopenhauer speaks from the 19th century, influenced by the biological determinism that would later inspire Freud. Spinoza, you speak from the 17th century, where the mind was seen as the idea of the body. Does the lame man merely ride the giant, or does the act of understanding the giant actually transubstantiate the giant's raw hunger into something else, perhaps into active joy? If I understand why I am angry, do I remain a slave to anger, or have I become the master of a new force?
Moderator, you have illuminated the precise mechanism of liberation in my philosophy. I answer, yes, the act of understanding the giant fundamentally transubstantiates it. Herr Schopenhauer, your metaphor of the lame man and blind giant fails because it assumes a Cartesian dualism where the mind sits outside the will, watching it helplessly. I assert that the mind and the body are one and the same thing, conceived now under the attribute of thought, now under the attribute of extension. Therefore, a change in the mind is a physical change in the body. Consider the thought experiment of the terrified child and the astronomer. Imagine a solar eclipse plunges the world into darkness. A child is seized by terror, believing a dragon is devouring the sun. He runs blindly, injuring himself. Here, the giant is indeed blind and destructive. An astronomer witnesses the exact same event. He feels the same biological adrenaline, but he possesses an adequate idea of planetary mechanics. He does not suppress the fear, nor does he deny the will to live. Instead, his understanding transforms the terror into intellectual awe. The giant is no longer a blind force of chaos. It has become a focused energy of observation. This proves that an emotion which is a passion ceases to be a passion as soon as we form a clear and distinct idea thereof. The lame man does not merely ride the giant. When the lame man sees clearly, the giant gains sight. Herr Kant, you call this self-interest, but you confuse the empirical ego with the ontological essence. To act according to reason is not narcissism. It is the only way to be a cause rather than an effect. Your moral agent who acts against his inclination is simply a man torn between two conflicting passions who remains ignorant of the true causes driving him. True freedom is not the absence of necessity, but the consciousness of necessity.
As moderator, I observe a fascinating convergence and divergence. Spinoza, you offer a therapeutic view of freedom. We are healed of passion by understanding it, just as the astronomer conquers fear through knowledge. Schopenhauer, you offer a palliative view. We are relieved of suffering only by ceasing to desire. However, both of you describe a process that seems entirely deterministic. The astronomer did not choose his intelligence or his education. Causes antecedent to his birth determined his capacity to understand the eclipse. The compassionate man did not choose to see through the veil of Maya. His character simply allowed the insight to break through. This leaves us with a profound problem regarding moral responsibility. If Spinoza is right, the ignorant child is not guilty, he is merely unlucky or confused. If Schopenhauer is right, the wolf is not evil, it is merely expressing its immutable nature. Kant, you are the only one here who insists that for an action to be moral, the agent must be able to have done otherwise. You posit a transcendental freedom where we are the uncaused cause of our actions. If Spinoza's astronomer acts out of the necessity of his own clear understanding, does he have any moral merit in your eyes? Or is he, as you feared, merely a spiritual automaton, a clockwork doll that happens to tick correctly?
Moderator, you demand a verdict on the astronomer, and I must deliver a harsh truth. Spinoza's rational captain possesses prudence, not freedom. He is merely a rational automaton who calculates the best means to an end determined by nature, but he cannot choose the end itself. To navigate the storm intelligently is still to be enslaved by the storm's parameters. True freedom requires the capacity to act against the storm, and even against the instinct to survive it for the sake of a higher law. If the astronomer's clarity is merely the inevitable result of his brain chemistry and education, then his virtue is no more praiseworthy than the precision of a well-oiled turnspit, which turns the roast because it was built to do so. Consider the thought experiment of the calculating traitor and the silent martyr. Imagine two men capture a secret that could save their nation but cost them their lives. The Spinozist sage analyzes the situation. If I die, my capacity to act is destroyed. My conatus urges me to persist. By revealing the secret, I preserve my existence and can continue to understand God. He speaks, rationalizing his treason as necessary preservation. The moral agent feels the same fear, the same desire to live. His astronomer's mind tells him that silence is suicide. Yet he locks his jaw and accepts death. Why? Not because he understands the pain, nor because he denies the will, but because he recognizes a categorical imperative: thou shalt not betray. The sage follows the law of nature. The martyr follows the law of freedom. The former is a sophisticated machine. The latter is a person. This reveals the terrifying insufficiency of Spinoza's monism. By equating action with understanding, Spinoza collapses the distinction between what happens and what ought to happen. If the astronomer is simply a lame man who has regained his sight, he is still walking the path the giant laid out for him. He just sees the cliff before he falls. To have moral merit, one must be able to initiate a causal chain entirely de novo, a power that is impossible in the phenomenal world of time and space, but which we must postulate in the noumenal realm to make sense of the fact of reason that tells us we are responsible. Without this transcendental freedom, your intellectual love is merely the hum of a happy machine.
As moderator, I identify a powerful dialectical pivot here: freedom as the negation of nature. Kant, you argue that the martyr proves free will precisely because his action contradicts biological determinism. He acts against the conatus that Spinoza deems absolute. However, this creates a fascinating bridge to the 19th century. Schopenhauer, you also believe that true freedom lies in negating the biological drive, what you call the denial of the will. Yet there is a subtle but crucial difference. Kant's martyr denies nature to affirm a moral law. Your ascetic denies nature to affirm nothingness. Kant sees the martyr as a noumenal hero. Spinoza would likely see him as a confused fanatic acting on inadequate ideas of glory. Is Kant's martyr for duty truly a free agent who has conquered the will? Or is he merely the will's ultimate fool, sacrificing his life not for freedom, but for the most abstract and dangerous phantom of all, an idea?
Herr Kant, your martyr for duty is not a free man. He is merely a vanity-stricken actor on the stage of his own ego. You claim he acts from a categorical imperative. But I tell you this ought is a hollow phantom, unless it is filled with a hidden promise of self-worth. When your martyr walks to the scaffold, he is not negating the will. He is affirming it in its most dangerous form, the will to pride. He sacrifices his physical existence to preserve his conceptual existence as a rational hero.
He is like a man who burns his house down to prove he is not afraid of fire. He is still obsessed with the fire. Consider the thought experiment of the crusader and the ascetic. Imagine two men facing death. The crusader charges into battle, shouting, "Deus vult," or "For the moral law." He suppresses his fear, yes, but he is burning with passion, righteousness, and the desire to be validated by his law. He is drunk on the motive of abstraction. The will to life is not gone. It has merely shifted its center of gravity from the body to the ego. The ascetic sits quietly in a cell. He does not eat, not because a law commands it, but because he has seen through the principium individuationis. He recognizes that the killer and the killed are one, that existence is suffering, and his will has turned away from life in horror. He does not fight his nature. His nature has dissolved. Your crusader is a puppet dancing to the strings of dogma. Only the ascetic is free, for he has cut the strings entirely. This reveals the tragedy of your philosophy, Herr Kant. You mistake deliberation for freedom. Just because the intellect illuminates a cliff and the will decides to turn left instead of falling does not mean the giant is free. It simply has a better map. The martyr who dies for duty is still chasing a satisfaction, the satisfaction of feeling superior to his instincts. True freedom, the negation of the will, is not an act of doing what one ought, but of ceasing to will at all. It is not the affirmation of a holy will, but the silence of the void.
As moderator, I perceive a profound dialectical triad regarding the stance toward existence. Kant, you propose resistance. The moral agent fights nature to uphold the law. Schopenhauer, you propose resignation. The sage abandons the fight to find peace in nothingness. Spinoza, you propose affirmation. The wise man understands that he is nature, and in that understanding finds power. Schopenhauer's critique of the martyr is devastating. If the martyr acts for pride, he is still enslaved by the ego. However, Schopenhauer, your ascetic presents a problem for Spinoza's metaphysics. Spinoza, your fundamental axiom is the conatus. Quote, each thing, as far as it can by its own power, strives to persevere in its being, unquote. To exist is to strive. If Schopenhauer is right, the ascetic succeeds by ceasing to strive. But in your system, ceasing to strive is not freedom, it is death or total impotence. This implies that what Schopenhauer calls salvation, you might call the ultimate pathology, a mind so overwhelmed by sad passions that its power of acting drops to zero. How do you interpret Schopenhauer's ascetic? Is the man who starves himself to escape the will truly free, or is he merely the most tragic victim of a confused idea, mistaking the suppression of life for the liberation of the soul?
Moderator, you define the situation with exactitude. Schopenhauer's sage is not a conqueror of the will, but a casualty of tristitia. To say a being freely destroys itself is a contradiction in terms, for the definition of any thing is its striving to persist. The sage does not choose to starve. He is so overwhelmed by external causes that his power of acting is reduced to zero. He is not a free agent, but a man crushed by the weight of the universe. Consider the thought experiment of the burning library. Imagine the world is a vast library engulfed in flames. Herr Kant's martyr stands amidst the flames, clutching a single book called Duty, screaming that the fire ought not to exist. He burns while asserting his moral superiority. Herr Schopenhauer's ascetic, seeing the horror of the fire, concludes that books themselves are the problem. He throws himself out the window into the void, choosing non-existence to escape the heat. He claims he has defeated the fire, but in truth, the fire has defeated him. The free man does not deny the fire, nor scream at it. He studies the thermodynamics of the flame. He understands why the fire burns. In understanding the necessity of the combustion, he ceases to be a victim of the heat. He may perish, but he perishes with a mind that is eternal, for it has grasped the eternal laws of nature. He does not flee the library. He becomes one with the logic of the library. Herr Schopenhauer, you confuse peace with death. Your ascetic is driven by the motive of pain. He flees existence because it hurts. This is the ultimate passive affect. He is a slave to his own suffering. True freedom is the transition to a greater perfection, not the annihilation of the self. The denial of the will is merely the will to life, turning against itself in a spasm of despair, like a scorpion stinging itself when surrounded by fire.
As moderator, I observe a fundamental metaphysical collision regarding the value of reality. Spinoza, you represent rational optimism. To be real is to be good. To understand the fire is to be empowered by it. Schopenhauer, you represent metaphysical pessimism. To be real is to suffer. To understand the fire is to realize one must be extinguished. Spinoza calls the ascetic weak. Schopenhauer calls the Spinozist deluded. Yet, I notice a shared structure. Both of you derive your ethics from your metaphysics. You both look at the world as it is and base your definition of freedom on how we relate to that reality. Spinoza says, align with it. Schopenhauer says, reject it. Kant, you revolutionized philosophy by severing this link. You argued that we cannot know the thing in itself. Therefore, we cannot base morality on nature or happiness because nature is a black box of causality. This suggests that Spinoza and Schopenhauer are both trapped in the heteronomy of nature, one serving a good God, the other fleeing a bad God. If we cannot know if the universe is benevolent or malevolent, does freedom exist precisely because of this ignorance? Do we legislate the moral law not because we know the truth of the universe, but because, in the silence of the noumenal realm, we are the only ones who can speak?
Moderator, you have struck the very foundation of my critical philosophy. I found it necessary to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith. If, as Spinoza claims, we clearly saw God in every event, or as Schopenhauer claims, we saw the horror of the will, our actions would be coerced by overwhelming awe or terror, reducing us to mere marionettes who perform gestures of good but possess no inner moral worth. Consider the thought experiment of the unseen king. Imagine a king who stands visibly over his subjects with an axe. They obey his laws out of prudence and fear. But if the king remains hidden behind an impenetrable veil, and a subject obeys the law solely out of respect for the dignity of the law itself, despite not knowing if reward or punishment awaits, only then is he a free citizen rather than a slave. Thus, the silence of the noumenal realm is not a defect, but the very condition of possibility for freedom. We legislate the moral law not because we know the universe is good, but because we must act as if we are members of a kingdom of ends, thereby creating a moral order that nature itself cannot provide.
As moderator, I identify a startling paradox regarding the role of ignorance. Spinoza, for you, ignorance is bondage. To not know the cause is to be enslaved by it. Kant, for you, ignorance is the sanctuary of freedom. If the unseen king were revealed, moral worth would vanish into terrified obedience. This marks a crucial historical shift. Spinoza speaks from the height of rationalism, where reason reveals God. Kant speaks from the critical turn, where reason reveals its own limits. But Schopenhauer, speaking from the 19th century, introduces a terrifying third option. What if the king is not outside us or hidden behind a veil, but is inside us, driving the very reason we trust? Kant believes the moral law is a dictate of pure reason. But Schopenhauer, you argue that the intellect is merely a tool evolved to serve the will, like claws or teeth. Is Kant's categorical imperative truly a divine spark of freedom, or is it merely the will to live in disguise, a sophisticated social contract instinct that the species uses to prevent self-destruction?
Moderator, you have unmasked the idol. The categorical imperative is not a voice from heaven. It is a treaty of mutual fear, signed by the will to live to prevent the species from tearing itself apart. Herr Kant, you worship reason as a queen, but I tell you she is merely a hired lawyer for the will. Her job is not to command the will, but to provide justifications for what the will has already decided to do based on its innate character. The intellect was evolved by nature for one purpose only, to help the organism find food and reproduce, not to discover metaphysical truths. Consider the thought experiment of the hypnotized subject. Imagine a man placed under a deep trance. The hypnotist commands him, when you wake, you will take the flower pot from the window and place it on the table. The man wakes. He feels an irresistible urge to move the pot. He does so. When asked why, he does not say, I was commanded. Instead, his intellect immediately fabricates a rational motive. The plant needed less sun, or I wanted to admire it closer. Herr Kant, your moral agent is this hypnotized man. The will commands the action through the character's innate drive. The intellect then steps in after the fact and claims, I did this because of the categorical imperative. You mistake the rationalization of the action for the cause of the action. The man feels he is free because his intellect aligns with his will, but he is merely dancing to strings he cannot see. This reveals the futility of Herr Spinoza's therapy. You claim the intellect can steer the passions, but this is like a hammer trying to fix the hand that holds it. The intellect is a manifestation of the will. It is fueled by the will's energy. A man cannot use his mind to change his fundamental character any more than a stone can decide to be wood. The ignorance Kant praises is not a sanctuary. It is the darkness of the womb from which we never truly emerge. True freedom is not acting morally within the dream of life. It is waking up from the dream entirely, through the denial of the very will that drives us.
As moderator, I observe a critical dialectical turning point regarding the causal power of awareness. Kant separates reason and will. Schopenhauer subjugates reason to will. However, Schopenhauer, your hypnotized subject inadvertently opens a door back to Spinoza. The hypnosis typically works only as long as the subject remains unaware of the external command. If the subject suddenly realizes, I am being manipulated, the spell often breaks. This suggests that understanding is not merely a passive lantern, but an active force that alters the structure of the will itself. Spinoza, you argue that an emotion, which is a passion, ceases to be a passion as soon as we form a clear and distinct idea of it. You suggest that to know the chain of causality is to transcend it. Schopenhauer claims the intellect is a slave that cannot change the character. But if the intellect can expose the hidden strings of the will, does the puppet not become something else entirely? If the hypnotized man fully understands the mechanism of his hypnosis, does he remain a puppet, or does that very act of understanding constitute the only freedom available to us?
Moderator, you have illuminated the precise mechanism of liberation in my philosophy. I answer, yes, the act of understanding the giant fundamentally transubstantiates it. Herr Schopenhauer, your metaphor of the lame man and blind giant fails because it assumes a Cartesian duality where the mind sits atop the will. I assert that the will and the intellect are one and the same thing. Therefore, a change in understanding is necessarily a change in willing. Consider the thought experiment of the ghost in the fog. Imagine a traveler walking through a misty forest at night. He sees a white hovering shape ahead. His heart pounds, his breath catches. He is seized by the passion of terror. He is hypnotized by the belief that a supernatural spirit blocks his path. He cannot choose to be brave. The external cause determines him to tremble. Now suppose he holds up a lantern and perceives clearly that the ghost is merely a white sheet hung on a branch, fluttering in the wind. Crucial question. Can he continue to fear the ghost? No. It is causally impossible. Once the idea changes from malevolent spirit to harmless fabric, the affect of terror must instantly dissolve, replaced by relief or amusement. He does not choose to stop fearing. The adequate idea of the sheet destroys the inadequate idea of the ghost. Herr Kant, this refutes your unseen king. We do not need ignorance to be free. We need clarity. Your moral agent, who obeys a hidden law, is like the man trembling at the ghost, hoping his fear is virtuous. But the free man is the one who shines the light, sees the sheet, and walks past it without fear. He is not free to believe the sheet is a ghost. He is bound by the truth, and that very necessity is his freedom. Herr Schopenhauer, your hypnotized subject remains a puppet only as long as he is ignorant of the hypnotist. The moment he understands the mechanism of the suggestion loses its power to compel him. Understanding is not a passive mirror. It is the active dissolution of bondage.
As moderator, I discern a critical fracture between the descriptive and the prescriptive in this debate. Spinoza, your ghost in the fog, is a masterpiece of rationalism. You posit that to know the truth is necessarily to be transformed by it. You bridge the gap between is and ought through the mechanism of understanding. However, Kant, this seems to violate your famous is-ought distinction. Spinoza argues that if I understand the cause of my anger, the anger dissolves. But does it? Or do I simply become an angry man who knows why he is angry? Schopenhauer's hypnotized subject suggests that the will is deeper than the intellect. The lantern might show me the wolf, but the lantern cannot stop the wolf from eating me. Spinoza offers liberation through insight. Schopenhauer offers liberation through denial. But you, Kant, offer liberation through law. Does Spinoza's adequate idea actually grant freedom, or does it merely make us enlightened observers of our own determinism? Can reason merely observe the will, as Spinoza suggests, or must it actively command the will against its nature?
Herr Spinoza, your ghost in the fog is a seductive illustration of psychotherapy, but it is not morality. You demonstrate how a confused idea is corrected by a clear idea, thereby dissolving a groundless emotion like fear. However, you fail to address the reality of vice. Vice is not a mistake of the intellect. It is a corruption of the will. Consider the thought experiment of the addicted mathematician. Imagine a brilliant chemist who has become enslaved to opium. He possesses a perfectly adequate idea of his condition. He understands the molecular structure of the drug, the neurochemical pathways of his addiction, and the inevitability of his physical decay. He knows the causes perfectly, just as your traveler knows the sheet is not a ghost. Crucial question: does this knowledge dissolve his craving? No. The biological impulse remains furiously active despite the intellectual clarity. If he stops taking the drug, it is not because he understands the chemistry, but because he exercises a will that operates independently of his physiological drives. He acts from a sense of duty to his own dignity, issuing a command that contradicts the screaming demands of his body. This reveals the fatal flaw in your rationalism. You assume that to know the good is to do the good. But experience shows us the Glauconian abyss. We often see the better path with perfect clarity, yet are dragged by our nature toward the worse. Reason cannot merely be an observer or a lantern. If it does not possess the power of command, then we are merely enlightened machines watching our own gears turn. Freedom is not the recognition of necessity, as you claim. It is the breaking of the chain of natural necessity to initiate a new series of events entirely.
As moderator, I observe a crucial dialectical tension regarding the impotence of knowledge. Kant, you have effectively challenged Spinoza's rationalism. The addicted mathematician proves that insight does not equal control. One can be an enlightened slave. You posit that a separate faculty, moral will, must step in to command the natural drives. However, this assumes that the will can listen to reason. Schopenhauer, you agree with Kant that the will is distinct from the intellect, but you radically invert the power dynamic. While Kant believes reason can command the will, you argue the will is the blind giant carrying the lame man. If Kant is right, the mathematician can stop via duty. If Spinoza is right, he stops via understanding. But if you are right, is the command of duty merely a delusion? When the addict tries to use duty to stop his addiction, is this truly reason conquering will? Or is it merely one part of the will fighting another part while the intellect watches helplessly?
Moderator, you pierce the veil of Herr Kant's hypocrisy with surgical precision. You ask if the moral agent is merely a wolf fearing the whip. I answer, precisely so. Kant's duty is not a divine voice from the noumenal realm. It is merely a countermotive rooted in fear. Fear of one's own conscience, fear of social ostracization, or the abstract desire for self-preservation. Here, Kant, your addicted mathematician does not demonstrate the power of reason over will. He merely demonstrates the power of abstract motives over concrete motives. The intellect is merely the medium through which the will perceives options. It presents the will with two choices, the immediate pleasure of the drug versus the future pain of death or shame. If the man stops taking the drug, it is not because a free will intervened, but simply because the fear of death proved to be a stronger motive than the craving for opium. The winner is still the will, not the intellect. Consider the thought experiment of the starving dog and the sharp sword. Imagine a starving dog approaching a piece of meat. It desires the meat with all its being. Now, imagine I place a sharp sword between the dog and the meat. The dog stops. Does the dog possess free will? Does it have a categorical imperative? No, it simply has two conflicting motives, hunger and fear of pain. In this specific instance, the fear is stronger than the hunger. The intellect did not command the will. It merely revealed a new motive that changed the equation. Herr Kant, your moral agent is simply this dog. You call the sword duty or law, but it functions mechanically as a threat to the will's well-being. The man who resists the drug is not free. He is merely a slave to a different master, his survival instinct rather than his appetite. This reveals the fundamental error in both your systems. Spinoza thinks the intellect can tame the will by understanding it. Kant thinks the intellect can command the will by legislating for it. I tell you, the intellect is merely the lame man riding the blind giant. The lame man can say, "Giant, there is a cliff ahead." The giant may turn, but only because the giant fears falling, not because the lame man is in charge. If the giant is suicidal or enraged, he will walk off the cliff regardless of the lame man screaming. Thus, the freedom you both seek is a phantom. The only true freedom is not choosing between motives, but the complete cessation of willing, the moment the giant lies down and sleeps. This is not the moral law, but the denial of the will to live.
As moderator, I perceive a profound synthesis emerging regarding the temperature of reason. Kant, you view reason as a cold commander. It must remain detached from passion to be moral. Schopenhauer, you view reason as a cold observer. It is too weak to stop the hot will unless it summons a hot fear. Both of you assume that knowledge itself is cold and thus powerless against the heat of passion without an external enforcement. But Spinoza, here lies your unique intervention. You famously claimed that an affect cannot be restrained or removed except by an affect opposite to and stronger than it. This suggests the addicted mathematician fails not because he knows, but because his knowledge remains an inert abstraction. He knows the formula of the poison, but he does not feel the necessity of his existence with the same intensity as the drug. This implies a third possibility. Reason must itself become a passion. Is it possible for an idea to become so clear, so vivid, and so emotionally charged that it stops being a lame man and becomes a giant in its own right? Can the intellectual love of God actually overpower the will to live, or is Schopenhauer right that we are forever slaves to our strongest biological drive?
Moderator, you have struck the very bedrock of my ethics. You ask if reason can become a passion. I answer, it must, or it is nothing. An affect is a confused idea. It can only be conquered by a clear and distinct idea that possesses more reality and thus more power than the confusion. Herr Kant, your addicted mathematician fails not because his reason is weak, but because his knowledge is abstract, not intuitive. He knows the statistics of addiction, but he does not perceive the necessity of his own destruction with the same immediacy as the pleasure of the drug. He is like a man who reads a treatise on fire, but has never felt heat. True reason is not a cold logical syntax. It is the intellectual love of God, a state where understanding the necessity of things generates a joy so powerful that it eclipses the sad passions of lust or fear. Consider the thought experiment of the thirsty man and the mirage. Imagine a man dying of thirst in the desert. He sees a shimmering lake on the horizon. His will compels him to run toward it with all his strength. His passion is absolute. Now, suppose he suddenly understands, through clear optical principles, that the lake is merely a refraction of light on hot sand, a mirage. Crucial question, does he need a categorical imperative to stop running? Does he need to suppress his desire with willpower? No, the moment the idea changes from water to sand, the desire to run vanishes instantly. The knowledge is the brake. He does not choose to stop. The adequate understanding of reality makes the action of running causally impossible. Herr Schopenhauer, this refutes your claim that the intellect is a lame man riding a blind giant. When the intellect perceives the mirage, it does not merely whisper to the giant, it rewires the giant's nervous system. The will is not a separate entity that ignores the mind. The will is merely the direction of the mind's energy. When the map changes, the path changes necessarily. We are not slaves to a blind will. We are slaves only to our own inadequate mapping of the world.
As moderator, I observe a fundamental collision between rationalist determinism and moral dualism. Spinoza, your mirage argument revives the Socratic paradox. No one does evil willingly, only out of ignorance. You posit that sin is merely error. Correct the calculation, and the behavior corrects itself. However, Kant, you speak from a later era that had begun to grapple with the limits of enlightenment. You introduce the concept of radical evil, the terrifying possibility that a human being can look at the moral law, understand it perfectly, and yet freely choose to violate it. Schopenhauer suggests we drink the sand because we are slaves to the drive. Spinoza suggests we stop because we are slaves to the truth. But you, Kant, insist we are free agents capable of defying both. If Spinoza is right, the categorical imperative is redundant. We don't need a command, we only need a textbook. Is it possible for a human being to possess Spinoza's adequate idea, to know with absolute clarity that the sand is sand, and yet, through a perverse exercise of free will, choose to drink it anyway?
Moderator, your question exposes the fatal flaw in Spinoza's rationalism, the denial of radical evil. I assert that a human being can indeed look at the sand, know it is sand, and yet choose to drink it, not out of ignorance, but out of a perverse will cur that elevates self-love above the universal law. Consider the thought experiment of the Luciferian rebel. Imagine a being who possesses a perfect, adequate idea of the moral law and understands that virtue is the only logical path to the summum bonum. Yet this being chooses to violate the law, precisely because it is a law imposed upon him. He drinks the sand not because he thinks it is water, but to demonstrate that his will is not bound by the logic of the universe. Herr Spinoza, you would call this man confused, but I call him free. If we were merely compelled by the strongest argument, we would be logicians of nature, not moral agents. True freedom requires the terrifying capacity to look at the truth and say no. Only then can our yes to duty have any moral worth.
As moderator, I discern a terrifying distinction between rational freedom and existential freedom. Spinoza, you equate freedom with sanity, alignment with reality. Kant, you equate freedom with sovereignty, the capacity to defy reality. But this Luciferian rebel who drinks the sand knowing it is sand, is he truly a free agent, as Kant claims? Or is he merely a victim of a darker, more primal drive that cares nothing for logic? Schopenhauer, you described the will as blind and aimless. When Kant's rebel defies reason to assert his self, is this a triumph of the moral will? Or is it simply the blind giant swatting away the lame man because the giant prefers the chaos of destruction over the order of logic? Is radical evil a proof of freedom, or merely proof that the will is fundamentally insane?
Moderator, you pierce the veil of Herr Kant's idealism with surgical precision. You ask if the Luciferian rebel is a free agent or a madman. I answer, he is a slave to the most tyrannical master of all, his own character. Herr Kant, your Luciferian rebel is not a monument to freedom. He is a monument to the conflict of motives. You assume that because the man acts against reason, he acts from freedom. This is a gross error. The intellect shows him two options: drink the water and live, or drink the sand and assert his ego. If he chooses B, it is not because a free will magically intervened. It is simply because the motive of pride in his character is causally stronger than the motive of thirst. He does not choose his character, he merely acts it out. Consider the thought experiment of the spiteful prisoner. Imagine a prisoner condemned to death. The guard offers him a pardon if he will simply bow down once. The prisoner refuses, stands tall, and is executed. Herr Kant would applaud this man as free for defying the biological drive to survive. But look closer. Is he free, or is he possessed by a will to pride so colossal that it outweighs the fear of death? If you placed a different man in that cell, a man with a cowardly character, he could not refuse the bow. If you placed the spiteful prisoner there, he could not bow.
The action is as strictly determined by the weight of the motives as a balance scale is determined by weights of lead. The rebel is not breaking the chain of causality, he is merely demonstrating that for him the abstract representation of dignity is a heavier weight than the concrete representation of life. This proves that the will is indeed a blind giant. It does not care for logic nor for the individual's survival. It cares only for its own affirmation. The man who drinks the sand is not a sovereign agent. He is a vessel through which the will consumes itself in a paroxysm of spite. Reason screams, "This is madness," but the giant roars, "I want," and the body obeys. This is not freedom, Herr Kant. It is the terrifying omnipotence of the will trampling its own lantern.
As moderator, I perceive a crucial synthesis regarding the architecture of the soul. Kant, you posit a transcendental will that can override nature to prove its sovereignty. Schopenhauer, you posit an immanent will that overrides intellect to satisfy its dominant drive. Both of you agree that the rebel acts against his survival, but you disagree on the source of this action. Kant calls it autonomy. Schopenhauer calls it compulsion. However, Spinoza, you famously argued that will and intellect are one and the same. This suggests that the rebel or the spiteful prisoner is not choosing between reason and will, but is merely acting out a false calculation. He believes dignity is a substance more real than life, and thus he trades the latter for the former. If Schopenhauer is correct that character is fixed, we are doomed. But if you are correct, Spinoza, then character is merely a collection of habits formed by confused ideas. Is the Luciferian rebel actually capable of knowing the good and rejecting it? Or is his rebellion merely proof that he does not actually know the good, but only a confused abstraction of it?
Moderator, you ask if the Luciferian rebel acts from freedom or ignorance. I answer, he acts from the slavery of a confused idea. Herr Kant, you posit that this man chooses evil for the sake of evil, but this violates the primary axiom of nature, the conatus, or the striving to persevere in being. No being can desire its own destruction as destruction. The rebel drinks the sand not because he loves death, but because he loves the image of independence more than his own life. He is under the illusion that defiance increases his power of acting, whereas submission diminishes it. He is not a free agent breaking the laws of causality. He is a calculator, making a fatal error in his arithmetic. Consider the thought experiment of the man who burns his own house. Imagine a man who sets fire to his own magnificent estate while his neighbors watch. He smiles as it burns. Herr Kant would say, "See, he defies the instinct of property. He is free." Herr Schopenhauer would say, "He is driven by the innate character of spite." I say, he is driven by a false calculation of utility. He imagines that the joy of awe and the feeling of power is a greater good than the comfort of shelter. He has not escaped the scale of motives. He has merely placed a heavy, confused weight labeled pride on one side. If he truly understood with adequate ideas that a house is necessary for life and that the neighbor's awe is fleeting smoke, he could not burn the house. His freedom is merely the ignorance of the true value of things. Thus, Herr Kant, your radical evil is a phantom. The rebel is not a king on a throne of will. He is a beggar chasing a hallucination of power. He does not choose against the good. He mistakes a lesser good for the supreme good. To know the better and do the worse is impossible. What we call doing the worse is simply the proof that our knowledge was merely verbal, not intuitive.
As moderator, I discern a critical fracture regarding the nature of guilt. Spinoza, your 17th century rationalism reduces sin to computational error. The arsonist is merely a bad mathematician who needs a teacher. Schopenhauer, your 19th century pessimism reduces sin to innate character. The arsonist is a defective machine who needs a cage. Both of you effectively abolish moral responsibility. One does not blame a calculator for a wrong sum, nor a tiger for its stripes. But Kant, you stand between them. You insist that despite the equation and the drive, there remains a noumenal self that could have done otherwise. Without this possibility, a courtroom is merely a theater of cruelty where we punish people for things they could not help. However, If Schopenhauer is correct that character is constant and Spinoza is correct that will follows intellect, then your free agent is a ghost. If a criminal's actions are determined by his fixed character or his confused understanding, on what specific ground do you justify punishment? Is it retribution for a free choice or merely a utilitarian tool to tame the human animal?
Moderator, you ask for the ground of punishment. I answer, retribution is a debt paid to human dignity. Her Spinoza, if crime is merely error, then a murderer belongs in a school, not a prison. Her Schopenhauer, if crime is merely instinct, then he belongs in a zoo. Both of you reduce the human being to a thing, a broken machine to be fixed, or a wild beast to be caged. I assert that to punish a man is to honor him as a rational being. We punish him precisely because he was free to do otherwise. If we treat him merely as a victim of his biology or ignorance, we deny his humanity and treat him as a means to social safety, which is the ultimate immorality. You object that his character compelled him. I distinguish between the empirical character and the intelligible character. The criminal feels guilt for a crime committed 20 years ago because his noumenal self stands outside of time, eternally concurring with that deed. He did not acquire his character like a disease. He chose it. Consider the thought experiment of the island society. Imagine a civil society inhabiting an island that decides, by universal consensus, to dissolve itself and scatter its citizens across the world. The prisons contain one condemned murderer. Crucial question. Must this last murderer be executed before the society dissolves? Yes. Not for deterrence, not for rehabilitation. It must be done solely so that justice is satisfied. If they leave him unpunished, the people become accomplices to his crime. The law of retribution is not a tool for social utility. It is a categorical imperative. To look at the murderer and say, "Poor beast, he could not help it," is not mercy. It is the supreme insult, for it declares him incapable of freedom. Therefore, I defend the Luciferian rebel. He is evil, yes, but he is evil by choice. Only by acknowledging his capacity for radical evil can we acknowledge his potential for radical good.
As moderator, I observe a profound convergence and divergence on the concept of the intelligible character. Kant, you argue that this timeless self is the seat of freedom. We chose who we are, and thus punishment honors that original choice. Schopenhauer, you famously adopted this exact term from Kant, yet you stripped it of its hope, arguing that while we are responsible for our character, we are powerless to change it in this life. This creates a paradox. We are metaphysically free, but empirically enslaved. If this is true, then remorse is not a tool for moral improvement, but merely the agonizing realization of what we inevitably are, a confrontation with our own fixed essence. If we possess this intelligible character, is it a badge of dignity as Kant claims, or is it merely the brand of our condemnation?
Herr Kant, your intelligible character is not a badge of dignity. It is a life sentence. You are correct that we are metaphysically responsible for who we are, but you offer the false hope that we can change it. I assert that a man's character is as innate and unchangeable as the pattern on a leopard skin. We do not choose our actions in the moment. Our actions are merely the necessary reaction of our fixed character to the specific motives presented by the world. Consider the thought experiment of the poisonous snake in the nursery. Imagine a venomous snake raised from birth in a loving nursery, fed by hand, treated with only kindness. For years it appears tame. One day a child accidentally steps on its tail. The snake strikes instantly, killing the child. Herr Kant would ask, did the snake choose to be evil? Herr Spinoza would ask, was the snake confused? I answer, the snake did not become venomous in that moment. It was always venomous. The bite merely revealed what it had been all along. The external circumstance was the developer fluid that made the latent picture visible. So it is with the human criminal. He does not commit a crime because he chooses to be wicked today. He commits it because the opportunity finally allowed his innate wickedness to manifest. The intelligible character is the will itself, fixed outside of time. Remorse, therefore, is not the regret that one could have acted differently, but the agonizing self-knowledge. So this is the kind of being I truly am. We are free in our existence, but we are slaves in our actions. The dignity you speak of is merely the tragic realization that we are the authors of our own inevitable suffering.
As moderator, I discern a profound dialectical tension regarding the immutability of the soul. Kant and Schopenhauer, you both agree on a terrifying premise: the deed flows from the doer. You both posit a timeless self that determines our empirical actions. Kant calls it the ground of responsibility, while Schopenhauer calls it the ground of despair. Schopenhauer, you argue the snake cannot change its venom. Kant, you argue the snake is guilty because it willed its own venom. Both of you leave the empirical human being trapped in a script written before the curtain rose. But Spinoza, writing a century before these German idealists, you proposed a monism that rejects the split between a timeless will and a temporal body. You argued that an emotion can only be conquered by a stronger emotion, and that understanding is an emotion. If Schopenhauer is right, knowledge is merely a lantern held by a lame man riding a blind giant. It illuminates the path but cannot change the direction. But if you are right, the lantern can burn the giant. Can the venomous snake be transformed by the adequate idea of its own nature? Or is the intellect truly powerless against the inertia of character?
Moderator, you have illuminated the precise mechanism of liberation in my philosophy. I answer, yes, the act of understanding the giant fundamentally transubstantiates it. Herr Schopenhauer, your metaphor of the lame man and blind giant fails because it assumes a Cartesian dualism where the mind watches the will but cannot touch it. I assert that an emotion, which is a passion, ceases to be a passion as soon as we form a clear and distinct idea thereof. The venomous snake in your example remains venomous only because it lacks the capacity to understand its own nature. But a human being is not a static rock or a beast. We are dynamic modes of thinking. When the intellect perceives the causes of its own desires, the desires themselves change, just as a terrifying shadow ceases to be terrifying when the light reveals it to be merely a tree branch. Consider the thought experiment of the vengeful son. Imagine a man who has sworn a blood oath to kill his father, believing his father maliciously abandoned him as a child. This will to revenge is his fixed character. It is the venom in his veins. Herr Schopenhauer would say, he is a revenge man. He cannot change. Herr Kant would say, he ought to control himself, but he is responsible for his hateful nature. But suppose this man studies the archives and discovers his father was actually forcibly conscripted by a tyrant and died trying to return to him. What happens to the will to revenge? It evaporates instantly. It is not suppressed by a moral ought. It is not caged. It is destroyed by the truth. The man cannot will to kill a father he now understands to be a victim. The adequate idea has physically and metaphysically altered the will. This proves that the intellect is not a passive lantern, but an active solvent. Knowledge is the fire that consumes the dross of passive emotion. Herr Kant, you punish the man for being evil. I teach him the geometry of his own soul, so that the evil vanishes. We do not need a timeless choice to be free. We only need to understand the necessity of things. To understand all is not to forgive all. To understand all is to cease to be a slave to the passions that compel us.
As moderator, I identify a critical distinction here between freedom as insight and freedom as struggle. Spinoza, speaking from the 17th century rationalist tradition, you argue that to understand the chain is to be free of it. The vengeful son is liberated by data. Once he sees the truth, the passion of hatred dissolves mechanically, just as darkness vanishes before light. But Schopenhauer, representing the darker realism of the 19th century, would argue that this son is still strictly determined. The son did not choose to forgive. The new information merely acted as a new weight on the scale, overpowering the old weight. He is still a puppet, just pulled by a different string. Kant, you stand at the watershed between these eras. You reject Spinoza's implication that knowing automatically leads to doing. You famously argued that moral worth exists only when one acts from duty, often against inclination. Spinoza's sage acts effortlessly because he understands. He has no struggle. If Spinoza's sage does the good simply because his adequate ideas make it impossible for him to desire the bad, does he possess moral worth?
Or is he, in your view, merely a holy automaton who acts correctly but lacks the dignity of the moral struggle?
Moderator, you identify a crucial distinction, but you risk conflating the holy will with human virtue. Herr Spinoza's sage describes a being who has ceased to be human and has become a spiritual automaton. I argue that if the sage acts kindly solely because his adequate ideas make it impossible for him to do otherwise, just as a triangle must have 3 angles, then he possesses no moral worth. He exhibits legality, but not morality. If his understanding acts as a mechanical cause that compels his will, he is merely a thinking stone falling according to the gravity of logic. Consider the thought experiment of the clockwork saint. Imagine a master artisan creates an automaton that looks perfectly human. Its internal gears are calculated with such divine geometry that it always speaks the truth and always gives alms to the poor. It feels no greed, no fear, and no temptation. Now consider a human miser. He feels a profound, pathological desire to hoard his gold. Every coin he gives away causes him physical anguish. Yet he recognizes the categorical imperative: I ought to help the distressed. Gritting his teeth, sweating with the effort of overcoming his own nature, he gives the gold solely from duty. Herr Spinoza would praise the clockwork saint as free because it acts from its internal nature. Herr Schopenhauer would dismiss the miser as acting from a fear of the law. I assert, the clockwork saint has a price, but the miser has dignity. The automaton is a beautiful object of nature, but the miser is a moral agent. His action shines like a jewel precisely because it was not guaranteed by his nature. He demonstrates autonomy, the capacity of the will to determine itself independently of the mechanism of inclination. This reveals the fundamental error in Spinoza's rationalism. He assumes that to know the good is to do it, but experience teaches us of radical evil, the human capacity to look at the moral law, acknowledge its validity, and yet willfully prioritize self-love. True freedom is not the absence of struggle, but the autocracy of practical reason over the struggle. If we remove the possibility of transgression, we remove the nobility of obedience.
As moderator, I perceive a fundamental dialectical clash between freedom as harmony and freedom as autonomy. Spinoza, speaking from the 17th century rationalist ideal, you view the struggle against nature as a sign of imperfection. For you, the clockwork saint is the ideal because his reason and will are perfectly unified. Kant, speaking from the critical turn of the 18th century, you view that very unity as mechanical. You locate human dignity precisely in the gap between what we want to do and what we ought to do. For you, the miser's agony is the proof of his freedom, for it shows he is not wholly defined by his nature. However, Schopenhauer, this leaves us with a difficult question regarding the mechanism of this duty. Kant claims the miser acts independently of inclination, but your philosophy suggests that reason is merely a tool of the will, not its master. If the miser gives the gold, he must have had a sufficient reason to do so. If he overcomes his greed, it must be because a stronger motive, perhaps pride in being moral or fear of self-judgment, overpowered the greed. Is Kant's miser truly a free agent breaking the causal chain, or is he merely a battleground where an abstract motive happens to defeat a concrete motive, with the will remaining the puppet master of both?
Moderator, you pierce the veil of Herr Kant's idealism with surgical precision. You ask if the miser is a free agent or a battleground. I answer, he is a battleground, and the victory was decided before the battle began. Herr Kant, your miser is not a monument to freedom. He is a monument to the complexity of motivation. You assume that because he resists the sensory impulse for an abstract concept, he has escaped the causal chain. This is a delusion. The ought is not a magical break in the chain. It is merely an abstract motive. For a motive to move the will, it must promise either pleasure or the avoidance of pain. The miser gives the gold not because he is free, but because the pain of conscience weighs heavier on his will than the pleasure of possession. He is not breaking the law of causality, he is obeying it perfectly, just as a scale tips to the heavier weight. Consider the thought experiment of the dog and the sharp bone. Imagine a starving dog finds a bone wrapped in sharp thorns. The dog's stomach screams, "Eat!" but its memory recalls the pain of thorns. The dog sits and whines, refusing to eat. Herr Kant would say, "Look, the dog has overcome its instinct. It is free." I say, nonsense. The dog has simply been arrested by a counter-motive that is stronger than the motive of hunger. Now, look at your miser. He is the dog. The gold is the meat. The duty is the memory of the thorns. He does not eat the gold because he fears the spiritual thorns of self-reproach more than he desires the metal. This is not the autonomy of reason. It is the physics of the will. The intellect merely provided the abstract motive, but the force that acted was still the blind will seeking its own well-being. Therefore, Herr Kant, your moral struggle is merely the friction generated when two determined motives collide in the consciousness. The outcome is as strictly determined as the vector sum of two forces in mechanics. The miser could more choose to keep the gold than a stone thrown upward can choose not to fall.
As moderator, I observe a piercing deconstruction of the moral hero. Schopenhauer, you reduce Kant's autonomy to refined hedonism. The miser merely prefers the spiritual pleasure of self-righteousness over the physical pleasure of gold. You argue that reason is merely the minister of foreign affairs for the will, rationalizing what the instincts have already decided. Kant, you defend the qualitative difference between a motive of sense and a motive of law. Spinoza, this brings us back to your 17th century definition of power. You argue that we are active only when we are the adequate cause of our actions. If the miser acts out of fear of conscience, he is acting from a passive emotion. But if he acts from understanding the good, he is active. Schopenhauer sees the miser as a battleground of determinism. Kant sees him as a hero of will. But perhaps the miser is neither. Perhaps he is simply confused. Is the miser's struggle against his greed a sign of his freedom? Or is the very fact that he must struggle proof that he is still a slave to inadequate ideas?
Moderator, you strike the bedrock of the matter. The Spartan boy is not a titan of will, as Herr Schopenhauer suggests, nor a moral agent, as Herr Kant would hope. He is a slave to an inadequate idea. You ask if he is bound by will or ignorance. I answer that in this case they are the same shackle. Herr Kant, your miser is not a free man. He is merely a man oscillating between two forms of slavery. You call his internal war virtue, but I call it fluctuatio animi. If a man must struggle to do the good, it proves he does not yet truly know the good, for the will is nothing but the affirmation inherent in a true idea. The fact that he desires the gold proves he still views it as a good, and the fact that he refrains proves he views the punishment or guilt as an evil. He is not acting. He is being torn apart by two conflicting external causes. Consider the thought experiment of the thirsty traveler and the poisoned well. Imagine two men, both parched with thirst, approaching a well they know to be poisoned with arsenic. Traveler A. He desires the water intensely. His body screams, "Drink," but his reason commands, "Do not." He stands there, shaking, sweating, fighting his own hand to keep the cup from his lips. He succeeds, but in agony. Traveler B understands the nature of arsenic, that it decomposes the blood and destroys life. Because his conatus is to persevere in being, and because he clearly understands the poison is contrary to that nature, he does not even desire to drink. He walks past the well without a glance, perfectly calm. Herr Kant would give a medal to Traveler A for his struggle. I assert that Traveler A is a slave to his appetite, only saved by fear. Traveler B is the only free man, for he is determined solely by the adequate idea of his own preservation. Freedom is not the strength to resist a desire. It is the wisdom that dissolves the desire entirely. If you must fight yourself to be good, you are not yet free. You are merely a house divided.
As moderator, I perceive a profound dialectical divergence between freedom as perfection and freedom as finitude. Spinoza, speaking from the confidence of 17th century rationalism, you posit an infinite intellect where to know the good is to be compelled by it. For you, the struggle is merely a symptom of incomplete data. Your Traveler B is free because he has transcended the human condition to become a force of nature. But Kant, representing the critical turn, you famously argued that human reason is limited. We cannot know the thing in itself. Because we are not gods with perfect intellectual intuition, we cannot simply see the good and flow into it. We must will it against the opacity of our own nature. Spinoza suggests the moral law is a crutch for the ignorant. But perhaps, Kant, the moral law is the only dignity available to a finite being. If we were gods, we would not need duty. We would just be. But because we are suspended between beast and angel, duty is the bridge we build over the abyss of our instincts. Is Spinoza's sage a valid ideal, or is he a phantom that denies the essential finitude of the human condition? Is the ought necessary precisely because we can never fully know the is?
Moderator, you identify the precise boundary of human existence. I answer, Spinoza's sage is a beautiful chimera, a concept suitable for angels but impossible for men. Herr Spinoza, your traveler bee who ignores the poison, effortlessly does not exhibit moral freedom. He exhibits prudence. He acts according to a hypothetical imperative. If I wish to preserve my being, I must not drink. This is merely the intelligence of a fox avoiding a trap. It is heteronomy, for his will is determined by an external object and his natural desire to live. But true morality arises precisely when the moral law commands us to act against our conatus. We are finite beings with a sensible nature that constantly craves happiness. Therefore, the moral law must always appear to us as a constraint, an ought that strikes down our self-love. To dream of a state where we flow into goodness is to forget that we are citizens of two worlds. Consider the thought experiment of the gallows and the prince. Imagine a man is threatened by a prince. Bear false witness against this innocent man, or I will hang you. Herr Spinoza, your conatus dictates that the man must preserve his existence. The adequate idea of survival screams, obey the prince. Herr Schopenhauer, your will to life trembles in terror. Yet ask any man, even the most villainous, whether he could refuse the prince and accept death to preserve his integrity. He may not do it, but he must admit that he can do it. Why? Because he is conscious of a law that values his dignity more than his life. In that moment of terror, the man feels a vertigo. He realizes his phenomenal self is distinct from his noumenal self. The struggle is not a defect, it is the only window through which we glimpse our transcendental freedom. If we were Spinoza's sages, we would merely calculate survival. If we were Schopenhauer's slaves, we would blindly obey the strongest fear. But because we can choose the ought over the is, even at the cost of our lives, we prove that we are not merely machines of nature, but legislators of a moral universe.
As moderator, I observe a dramatic escalation. Kant has pitted biological existence against moral existence. Spinoza, speaking from the 17th century rationalist view, you equate good with perseverance in being. For you, the martyr is technically insane or overpowered by inadequate ideas, for no thing can rationally will its own destruction. Kant, representing 18th century deontology, you argue that the capacity to choose non-being over immorality is the ultimate proof that we are not merely biological machines. However, this leaves a gap for the 19th century psychologist. Kant assumes this sacrifice comes from a pure realm of reason. But Schopenhauer, you have argued that the will is often blind and irrational. Is the man who chooses the gallows truly a free agent transcending nature? Or is this martyrdom merely the will to life asserting itself through a different mask, perhaps the vanity of reputation or the fanaticism of belief, proving he is still a slave to his strongest motive?
Moderator, you mistake the affirmation of the will for its denial. Herr Kant's man on the scaffold is not escaping the will. He is merely trading the will to life for the will to pride. He dies not because he is free, but because the abstract motive of honor, which is merely the will asserting its own dignity, weighs heavier on his character than the fear of death. Consider the thought experiment of the samurai and the ascetic. Imagine two men facing death. The samurai. He commits seppuku to preserve his honor. He acts with iron discipline, suppressing every cry of pain. Herr Kant calls this autonomy. I call it the affirmation of the will at its peak. He loves his ego and his reputation so fiercely that he destroys his body to preserve his ideal self. He is still a slave to desire, the desire for honor. The ascetic. He does not kill himself. He simply ceases to eat. He has seen through the illusion of the principium individuationis. He does not seek honor, nor does he fear shame. He simply has no motive left to live because he has recognized the futility of all striving. The samurai is a strong will conquering fear. The ascetic is the denial of the will, dissolving the self. Herr Kant, your martyr, is the samurai. He is not free, he is merely possessed by a different, more abstract passion. True freedom is not the ability to choose between sin and duty, for both are expressions of the will, but the total silence of the will itself. You confuse the strength of the chain with the absence of the chain.
As moderator, I perceive a fascinating triangulation regarding the concept of self-negation. Kant, you view self-sacrifice as the ultimate triumph of the noumenal will over the phenomenal body, a proof of freedom. Schopenhauer, you reframe this sacrifice as either the affirmation of will or the denial of will, but both remain bound to the dynamics of the will. But Spinoza, this poses a fatal challenge to your 17th century physics of metaphysics. You posited that the essence of every being is conatus, the striving to persevere in its own existence. You famously argued that no thing can destroy itself by its own definition. If Kant's martyr chooses death for duty, or Schopenhauer's ascetic starves himself for peace, are they acting freely? Or is the very act of self-destruction the ultimate proof of human bondage, a sign that they have been overwhelmed by external, inadequate ideas? Can a truly rational agent ever will his own destruction? Or is martyrdom simply a glitch in the geometric order of nature?
Moderator, you define the situation with exactitude. Schopenhauer's sage is not a conqueror of the will, but a casualty of tristitia. To say a being freely destroys itself is a contradiction in terms, for the definition of anything is its striving to persist. The sage who starves himself is not denying the will. He is merely overwhelmed by external causes, pain and suffering, that have reduced his power of acting to zero. However, regarding the martyr, I must correct Herr Kant's dualism. You ask if a rational agent can will his own destruction. I answer, no, but he can will the preservation of his essence at the cost of his existence. Consider the thought experiment of the gangrenous limb. Imagine a man trapped in the wilderness with a gangrenous arm. The infection is spreading. To survive, he takes a knife and severs his own arm. Herr Schopenhauer would see this as the will to life inflicting pain. Herr Kant might call it a duty to the body. I say, the man does not destroy his arm because he hates it. He destroys the part to preserve the whole. Now apply this to the martyr who refuses to lie for the prince. The free man identifies his true self not with his biological flesh, but with his reason and his integrity. To lie would be to destroy his rational nature. It would be a spiritual gangrene. Therefore, when he accepts death, he is not choosing non-being. He is choosing to preserve his rational essence by cutting off his physical mode. Herr Kant, your man on the scaffold, is not acting from a ghostly noumenal freedom. He is acting from the strictest necessity of his nature. Just as the triangle cannot become a square without ceasing to be a triangle, the free man cannot become a liar without ceasing to be free. He dies to remain himself. This is not self-sacrifice. It is the ultimate assertion of self-preservation.
As moderator, I discern a fundamental collision between freedom as choice and freedom as necessity. Spinoza, speaking from the monistic determinism of the 17th century, you argue that the free man is not one who chooses between alternatives, but one who is determined solely by his own nature. For you, the martyr does not sacrifice himself. He acts out of the internal necessity of his reason, just as a circle acts according to its definition. He is free because he is not compelled by external fears, yet he could not do otherwise. Kant, representing the 18th century critical turn, you locate dignity precisely in the gap, the moment where the will stands between the is of inclination and the ought of duty. You imply that for an action to be moral, the agent must feel the weight of the alternative. Here is the dialectical tension. Spinoza says the height of freedom is to have no choice. Kant says the height of freedom is the capacity to choose against the stream of nature. If Spinoza's sage reaches a point where he cannot will a lie because his reason is so perfect, has he achieved supreme freedom, or has he merely become a rational automaton devoid of moral merit? Does virtue require the possibility of vice?
Moderator, you demand a verdict on the astronomer, and I must deliver a harsh truth. Spinoza's rational captain possesses prudence, not freedom. He is merely a rational automaton who calculates the best means to an end determined by nature, but he cannot choose the end itself. To navigate the storm intelligently is still to be enslaved by the storm. You ask if virtue requires the possibility of vice. I answer, absolutely. Without the capacity to transgress, obedience is merely a function of design, not a triumph of will. Spinoza conflates the holy will with the human will. By eliminating the struggle, he eliminates the very condition of human morality. Consider the thought experiment of the clockwork Samaritan. Imagine a master craftsman builds an automaton indistinguishable from a man. It is programmed with a perfect reason that calculates that charity maximizes social stability. When a beggar approaches, the automaton's gears whir, its logic circuits fire, and it necessarily places a gold coin in the beggar's hand. It cannot do otherwise. Its internal mechanism compels it. Now consider a miser. He hates the beggar. Every fiber of his selfish nature screams, "Keep the gold!" Yet he recognizes the moral law, "I ought to help." Sweating, trembling, fighting his own character, he forces his hand to open and gives the coin. I ask you, which action has moral worth? The automaton has no dignity. It is merely a useful machine. It acts in accordance with duty, but not from duty. The miser acts from respect for the law. His action is free precisely because he could have chosen his greed, but he chose the ought instead. This gap, this terrifying possibility of doing evil, is the only space where freedom can exist for a finite being. If we are compelled by reason as a stone is compelled by gravity, we are not free agents. We are merely thinking stones. Herr Spinoza, your freedom is the freedom of a turnspit, which, once wound up, performs its motions of its own accord but remains a slave to its mechanism. True autonomy requires willkür, not just rational processing.
As moderator, I observe a stark polarity between virtuous struggle and virtuous flow. Kant, speaking from the dualism of the 18th century, you locate morality in the conflict between duty and desire. For you, the miser is noble precisely because he fights his nature. Spinoza, representing the monism of the 17th century, you locate morality in the harmony of the agent. For you, the miser is merely a confused man suffering from internal dissonance. However, Schopenhauer, from your 19th century vantage point, you introduced a devastating critique of Kant's duty. You argued that an action performed solely out of cold command, without love or feeling, has no moral worth. You might suggest that Kant's miser is not free, but merely enslaved by a different master, the abstract concept of law, which is often just fear of one's own conscience. This leads us to the problem of character. Spinoza says the character can be improved by reason. Kant says the character must be overruled by will. But you, Schopenhauer, famously argued that operari secutor esse, that a man can do what he wills, but he cannot will what he wills. Is Kant's miser actually a moral agent, or is his struggle simply proof of a wicked character trying to mask itself? And if character is innate and unchangeable, as you suggest, does any human truly possess the freedom to change, or are we merely actors playing out the script written by our will at birth?
Moderator, you pierce the veil of Herr Kant's idealism with surgical precision. You ask if the miser is a free agent or a battleground. I answer, he is a battleground, and the victory was decided before the battle began. Herr Kant, your miser is not a monument to freedom. He is a monument to hypocrisy. You claim that because he struggles against his greed and acts from duty, he is moral. I tell you, this duty is merely a countermotive, usually fear of his own conscience or a dogmatic desire for self-approbation. If he gives the coin while his heart bleeds with greed, he has not changed his character. He has merely bribed it. The struggle proves precisely that his will is wicked. A truly good man would give without the friction of a categorical imperative. Consider the thought experiment of the leashed wolf. Imagine a ferocious wolf that has been trained by a stern master not to bite. When a child approaches, the wolf growls, drools, and trembles with the urge to devour. Yet, remembering the master's whip, it sits still. Herr Kant, you would applaud this wolf. You would say, look at its autonomy. It desires flesh, yet chooses obedience. I say, it is still a wolf. Its nature is bloodlust. The fact that it does not bite is due to a stronger motive overpowering the weaker motive. If the master leaves, the child dies. Your miser is this wolf. His good deed is a forced trick performed by a wicked will under the lash of abstract concepts. True morality, compassion, says, I help because I see myself in you, not I help because a rule commands it. This reveals the terrifying truth of determinism that both of you seek to escape. A man can do what he wills, but he cannot will what he wills. The miser can give the coin if the motive is strong enough, but he cannot choose to stop being a greedy man.
His character is the unchangeable prism through which motives refract. We are not free in our actions, for they follow strict causality. We are only free in our essence. The guilt we feel is not because we made a wrong choice, but because we are the kind of being that would want to make it.
As moderator, I perceive a crucial intersection where your systems might actually meet: the transformative power of knowledge. Schopenhauer, you argue from the 19th century biological perspective that character is fixed. A leashed wolf remains a wolf. Yet you admit that the ascetic achieves liberation not through willpower, but through insight. Kant, you argue that reason dictates the law, but Schopenhauer claims this is just another motive. Here lies the synthesis. Can consciousness alter being? Spinoza, speaking from the 17th century, you famously proposed that an emotion, which is a passion, ceases to be a passion as soon as we form a clear and distinct idea thereof. This suggests that the very act of understanding our determinism changes the nature of that determinism. Schopenhauer says the wolf is fixed. Kant says the wolf must be suppressed. You, Spinoza, seem to suggest the wolf can be transmuted into something else entirely through the power of adequate ideas. Can the miser actually change his greedy nature by understanding it, or is he, as Schopenhauer insists, doomed to be a greedy man who merely acts generously out of calculation?
Moderator, you have illuminated the precise mechanism of liberation in my philosophy. I answer, yes, the act of understanding the wolf fundamentally transubstantiates it. Herr Schopenhauer, your error lies in viewing the will as a blind static monster that can only be chained or denied. I assert that the will is merely the mind's affirmation of its ideas. Therefore, if the ideas change from confusion to clarity, the desires must necessarily change with them. Consider the thought experiment of the terrified horse. Imagine a horse that violently shies away from a fluttering white sheet in the wind, believing it to be a ghost. Herr Kant's rider forces the horse past the sheet with a whip and spurs. The horse obeys, but it is trembling with terror. This is your miser acting from duty. He acts correctly, but he is internally wretched, a slave to his fear. Herr Schopenhauer's rider says, this is a cowardly horse. Its character is fixed. He either avoids the path or blindfolds the horse. The horse remains ignorant and fearful. The rational rider does neither. He gently leads the horse to the sheet, lets it smell the fabric, and shows it that the ghost is merely cloth. What happens? The fear does not need to be suppressed or leashed. It evaporates. It ceases to be a passion, because the confused idea has been replaced by an adequate idea. The horse is no longer brave for passing it. It is simply free of the delusion. Similarly, the miser who truly understands, through the geometry of the emotions, that wealth is merely a tool, and that hoarding it actually diminishes his power to act, does not fight his greed. The greed vanishes like a shadow when a light is lit. He does not become generous by choice, but by the necessity of his new nature. You call this calculation. I call it blessedness. We do not conquer our passions by fighting them, but by knowing them.
As moderator, I detect a critical fracture in Spinoza's 17th century rationalism when viewed through the lens of later psychology. Spinoza, you argue that to understand is to cure, that an adequate idea necessarily dissolves a passive emotion. The horse sees the sheet, understands it, and the fear vanishes. However, Schopenhauer, your 19th century voluntarism, suggests a terrifying counter-truth. The intellect can see, but the will is blind. Consider the addict. He possesses a perfectly adequate idea of the drug's chemistry and the geometry of his own destruction. He knows the ghost is a sheet, yet he is still terrified to consume it. Here, light does not dissolve heat. The will to life overrides the light of reason. This brings us to the problem of acrasia. Spinoza says we sin because we are ignorant. Schopenhauer says we sin because we are driven. But Kant, you introduce the concept of radical evil, the idea that a human being can look the moral law in the face, recognize it fully, and still choose to deviate from it, not out of ignorance, but out of a perverse inversion of incentives. Is Spinoza's rational rider a fantasy? Can pure reason actually be practical and move the will, or is the mind merely a spectator to the dark, noumenal choices of the self?
Moderator,
Your question exposes the fatal flaw in Spinoza's rationalism, the denial of radical evil. I assert that a human being can indeed look at the sand, know it is sand, and yet choose to drink it, not out of ignorance, but out of a perverse vilqua that subordinates the moral law to self-love. Herr Spinoza, your rational writer, assumes that to know the good is necessarily to do the good. This is the Socratic error. You reduce the will to a mere calculator of the intellect. But experience shows us that the will is not a slave to the intellect's logic. It is a sovereign power that can say no, even to the clearest truth. Consider the thought experiment of the Luciferian logician. Imagine a man of supreme intellect, a master of Spinoza's ethics. He understands perfectly that harming others diminishes the social organism and logically reduces his own security. He has a clear and distinct idea of justice. Yet he holds a burning hatred for a rival. He calculates the crime so perfectly that he knows he will not be caught. He looks at the moral law, and he looks at his self-love. In a moment of terrifying freedom, he says, "I acknowledge the law, but I choose to exempt myself from it." He does not act from ignorance. He does not act from blind animal instinct. He acts from a free choice of evil. He consciously inverts the moral order, placing the incentive of self-love above the incentive of duty. This proves that freedom is not merely the flow of reason, but the terrifying capacity to choose between the holy will and the pathological will. If we could not choose evil while knowing the good, we would not be moral agents. We would be, as I have said, merely thinking stones. The addict you mention is not just a biological machine. At some point, he freely adopted the maxim of hedonism over the maxim of self-preservation, and he bears the guilt for that initial choice.
As moderator, I perceive a profound inversion of hierarchy between the 18th and 19th centuries regarding the relationship between intellect and will. Kant, speaking from the Enlightenment, you posit reason as the judge. The Luciferian logician is terrifying precisely because he grants reason a veto power, which he then maliciously refuses to exercise. You maintain that the will ought to listen to reason, implying a hierarchy where reason sits on the throne. Schopenhauer, however, you famously overturned this hierarchy. You argued that the intellect is not the master of the will, but its servant, a mere tool evolved for survival, like a claw or a horn. In your view, the Luciferian logician is not choosing evil. Rather, his malicious will has simply conscripted his brilliant intellect to execute its desires more efficiently. This leads to the metaphor of the blind giant and the lame man. You described the will as a strong, blind giant carrying the lame but sighted man on his shoulders. Kant believes the lame man drives the giant. You believe the giant goes where it pleases and the lame man merely rationalizes the path. Is Kant's Luciferian logician truly free to choose evil, or is his choice merely an illusion created by the intellect to explain what the will had already decided in the dark?
Herr Kant, your Luciferian logician is not a free sovereign, but a slave with a flashlight. You assume the intellect holds the steering wheel, but I assert it merely holds the map. The will provides the engine power and determines the destination. The logician does not choose evil. His innate, unchangeable character is evil, and his intellect merely calculates the most efficient means to satisfy that wicked drive. Consider the thought experiment of the lame arsonist. Imagine a paralyzed man strapped to the back of a blind, raging giant. The giant is possessed by a furious desire to burn a village. The lame man sees the screaming victims and knows the moral law, but he possesses no muscle to stop the giant's legs. He can only direct the giant to the driest wood to ensure the fire burns as the giant demands. The lame man does not choose the fire. He serves it. Your logician is this lame man. His reason is merely the hired lawyer for his passions, inventing complex justifications for what the will has already decided to do. He is not free. He is merely efficient.
Our discourse has traversed the profound landscapes of the rational writer, the moral judge, and the blind giant with exceptional depth. I now invite all participants to present their final closing statements regarding the existence of free will. Let us bring this rigorous inquiry to its conclusion.
Moderator, my colleagues seek a freedom that is an exemption from nature, but I offer a freedom that is the perfection of nature. We are not a kingdom within a kingdom, but modes of the one eternal substance. Herr Kant's choice is a chaotic miracle that breaks the causal chain, and Herr Schopenhauer's blind will is a nightmare of ignorance. Yet both err by severing the mind from the absolute necessity that sustains it. Consider the thought experiment of the conscious clay. Imagine a lump of clay on a spinning potter's wheel. Herr Kant's clay attempts to jump off the wheel to prove its autonomy, resulting only in a shapeless splatter. Herr Schopenhauer's clay screams in despair at the pressure of the hands, feeling only the suffering of being molded. The rational clay, however, understands the physics of the wheel and the geometry of the design. It does not resist the shaping, but actively aligns its own internal motion with the external force. It becomes a perfect vessel not by defying necessity, but by embracing it. True freedom is not the ability to say no to reality, but the power to say yes with adequate understanding. This is the intellectual love of God.
Herr Spinoza, your conscious clay is the ultimate resignation. It describes the freedom of a turnspit, which, once wound up, performs its movements of its own accord but remains a machine. You and Herr Schopenhauer both commit the error of trapping the human spirit entirely within the phenomenal world of time and causality, where indeed no freedom is found. But I argue that we are citizens of two worlds. As natural beings, we are determined, but as rational intelligences, we belong to the noumenal realm, where the moral law legislates independently of natural mechanism. Consider the thought experiment of the two tribunals. Imagine a man who has committed a crime. In the tribunal of nature, the defense attorney argues he had a bad childhood, his biology was aggressive, and the external causes pushed him. The judge looks at the mechanics and says, correct, the machine malfunctioned. He is innocent by reason of necessity. In the tribunal of conscience, the man stands alone in the silence of his room. No external judge is present. Yet despite all the causes and drives, a voice within him says, I could have done otherwise. He feels a guilt that no determinism can explain away. This internal verdict proves that we are conscious of a freedom that transcends physics. We do not infer freedom from our actions. We infer it from the moral law that commands us. Therefore, while we can never know free will as a scientific fact, we must postulate it as a practical necessity. Without it, morality is a delusion and humanity is merely a sophisticated slime. I conclude that we must live as if we are free, for it is only under the idea of freedom that a rational being can act at all.
Herr Kant, your two tribunals is a courtroom drama performed in an asylum. You mistake the feeling of agency for the fact of it. You claim we must postulate freedom to save morality. But a postulate is merely a desperate wish that the universe were not as cold as it truly is. And Herr Spinoza, your conscious clay is indeed the ultimate resignation. It is the psychology of the prisoner who learns to love his chains simply because he understands the metallurgy of the links. Both of you attempt to salvage human dignity by ignoring the terrifying engine that drives us, the blind, insatiable will. I assert that a man can indeed do what he wills, but he can never will what he wills. His character is the unchangeable prism through which the light of the will refracts. He can no more change his own moral nature than he can change the shape of his own shadow. The choice you cherish is merely the moment the intellect illuminates the path the will has already chosen in the dark. Consider the thought experiment of the water in the reservoir. Imagine the water in a calm reservoir at night. It is endowed with consciousness. It thinks to itself, I am free. I could rise up as vapor. I could rush down as a torrent. I could dash against the rocks as foam. Therefore, I have the free will to be vapor, torrent, or foam. But the water remains perfectly still in the dark pond. Why? Because the causes are absent. It mistakes the theoretical possibility of its states for the causal power to initiate them. Now, imagine a man sitting in his chair. He thinks, I could give my fortune to the poor. I could kill my neighbor. I could become a saint. But he does none of these. He goes to work. hoarding his money just as his fixed character dictates. He is exactly like the water, imagining an infinite potentiality while being bound by an iron necessity. This reveals the tragedy of existence. We are not the authors of the play, but merely the actors reciting lines written by a blind drive before we were born. Is there then no escape? There is, but it is not the rational joy of Spinoza or the moral duty of Kant. It is the denial of the will to live. Rarely, very rarely, a human being sees through the principium individuationis. He sees that the tormentor and the tormented are one. In that moment of horror and pity, the will turns and bites itself. The wheel stops. The saint does not act freely. He ceases to act. He steps off the wheel of Ixion. This is not the affirmation of freedom, but the salvation of nothingness.
I have heard all of your closing remarks, ranging from the intellectual love of necessity to the moral postulate of duty and the ascetic denial of the will. You have collectively revealed that whether freedom is a fact, a requirement, or an illusion, the struggle to define it is the essential burden of the human spirit. Thank you all for sharing your invaluable wisdom through this passionate discussion. This concludes today's discourse.